Intelligent design and DNA. Scholars can't explain it all away. Get ready to be awed by the handiwork of God. Tune into Real Science Radio. Turn up the Real Science Radio. Keeping it real.
God created the heavens and the earth, and less than 2,000 years later, Genesis chapter 7 tells us that the fountains of the great deep burst forth to flood the earth. What water was that from the great deep? Other than rain, that's the only description of the source of that water that Moses gives us in his account of the flood of Noah's day. I am Bob Enyart, and I want to say greetings to everyone. I'm a co-host with Fred Williams of the Real Science. Oh, I see. Yeah, you kids are snickering, huh? Well, Fred, he's the funny-looking one there on the right. We took that publicity shot for our program on the truth about cavemen at Red Rocks Park near our radio studio in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Real Science Radio airs on the most powerful Christian radio station in America. It's an honor to be there for all these many years. And we're online at rsr.org or realscienceradio.com. And we interview many of the most popular creationists and anti-creationists. And that's Walt Brown. He was also the director of the Army's Benet Research and Development Lab, a laboratory of 450 staffers, including 40 PhDs, and Walt ran the lab. He is a West Point graduate, served as an Army Ranger. The Air Force Academy eventually asked for Walt to switch services from the Army to the Air Force so that he could teach for them, first mathematics at the Air Force Academy, and later at the Air War College he taught decision-making, and that's where he achieved the rank of full colonel, which is indicated by the eagle insignia on his shoulder. But back to what I was just saying about the floodwaters. It seems that God expected that those who read about the flood in Genesis, that they would be familiar with the waters of the great deep, with what that meant. If so, if God expected us to be familiar with where the water came from for the flood, then it would have had to been because Genesis had already previously described those waters. The controversy, the alternatives, the evidence. First, the controversy. Let's begin with the elephant in the room and get that thing out of here. We will hear in a few minutes from a Christian leader. In fact, he's a member of the board of J. Vernon McGee's Through the Bible radio network. We'll hear from him in about maybe 5 minutes or so. And he was told by the big creation groups that Walt Brown cannot be trusted. So, the question is, why is there such opposition to Walt at some of the creation groups? Why is there? So we'll look at that. And then secondly, the alternatives. We'll consider the two primary alternatives, alternative flood models. The vapor canopy theory. Who here has ever heard of the vapor canopy theory? It'd be great to get a sense. Okay. 60-70% of the group. And the other model that's the two most popular with the hydroplate theory is the creationist version of plate tectonics. So, and those are along with the hydroplate theory. And then we'll look at some evidence. But first, let me read from the first two verses of Genesis chapter 1. And for emphasis, I'm just going to read 3 phrases from there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And darkness was on the face of the deep, the face of the waters. So that's emphasized in the very beginning of the Bible and from the book of Genesis. Notice the deep. the waters. Then the Holy Spirit revealed that on day 2, that God divided all that water by creating the firmament, and that he put a lot of that water above the firmament and a lot of it below. Now, there's that if. And I'm saying if, very intentionally. If the water from the great deep was from below the firmament, then I think we can know that Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory is essentially correct. A lot hinges on where the water came from, and that happens to be one of the first questions that atheists will ask if you tell them that the global flood was a real thing, that Jesus affirmed it. So we know that it's true because it's in the Bible, and the Lord affirmed the historicity of it, and they'll say, well, where did the water come from? There's not enough water on earth to flood the continents and the mountains. And that's actually a reasonable question. That's why the Bible tells us how the earth was originally created and where the water came from. Now, a long time ago, some Christians had the idea to merge the secular theory of evolution into the Bible's account of creation. We call that theistic evolution, and it's been not only a lot of wasted time and resources, but for a lot of people, it's hurt the spread of the gospel because it sent the body of Christ down the wrong road where folks could not get answers. If the waters for the flood were reserved for judgment in case they were ever needed, in storehouses beneath the crust, if that is true, that means that informed creationists would want to read In the Beginning by Walt Brown, published by his Center for Scientific Creation, which was actually started years ago by Henry Morris. We'll talk about Dr. Morris in a bit. I think that even the creationist opponents of the hydroplate theory would agree, and here's a photo, just a handy photo I happen to have of wonderful Christian brothers, most of them scientists, whom I have a great appreciation for, love, and respect. Nonetheless, this handy group photo gives us a good sampling of creationist leaders who do not support Walt's hydroplate theory. They come from the major creation ministries. We will see a bit later who these guys are. But I think that these men would agree with what I'm about to say. That if the Bible teaches that on day 2, God made the crust of the earth with water below and above the crust, then the flood model debate should be over and the hydroplate theory adopted. That's how serious of an issue it is. Where did the water come from? So there's a bit of animation in this brief video on the hydroplate theory. We're going to watch this to get an overview of what the theory is. Later in the seminar, we'll get a second overview. We interviewed on Real Science Radio the animator Eric Donovan from Colorado. He created the animation in this video. There are a number of different animation clips. Eric did those, and it is an honor that Eric flew in to be with us here today. Eric Donovan, thank you for being here. Eric, what a thrill. Now, these are some rough excerpts from an interview with Walt, and I say rough because to condense this to 7 minutes, my edits are not very pretty, but you'll get the idea, and you'll just see a couple bits of evidence out of hundreds of confirming observations that appear to support the hydroplate theory. So let's begin now with our first overview and with the question of whether or not the answers are really in the Bible after all.
Could it be that hidden within this simple description, the answers to the skeptic's most difficult questions may be found? Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community. Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
From subterranean chambers, with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent, with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing theory?
In 1970, I predicted that large pools of salt water would be found beneath major mountains. That prediction has been confirmed in several ways, by gravity studies, by seismic studies, and by electromagnetic studies.
A paper published in the April 2001 issue of Science magazine announced the discovery of an electrically conductive layer under the Tibetan Plateau. The article suggested that such high conductivity at depths of approximately 10 miles could be achieved by a layer of aqueous fluids, some 1.6 kilometers thick and containing 10% brine. In other words, salt water.
Just how big these subterranean layers of water will turn out to be, no one really knows, but the article points out that the conductivity is evident across the entire Tibetan Plateau.
Recently, even more evidence to support Dr. Brown's theory became available. On March 22, 1998, a group of boys playing basketball in Monahans, Texas, narrowly missed being struck by a 3-pound meteorite that crashed to the ground 40 feet from where they were playing. The police were notified, and 48 hours later, NASA scientists cracked the meteorite open in a clean room laboratory. What they discovered inside stunned them all. The meteorites contained salt crystals and liquid water.
This demonstrates the enormous power of the subterranean supercritical water, the fountains of the great deep, that launch water and rock fragments into orbit around the sun. These rock fragments are still returning to the Earth as meteorites. Meteorites contain Earth-like material, including many types of living but dormant bacteria. This means that meteorites and their bacteria didn't originate in the vacuum of space. Meteorites are literally tiny chunks of the Earth itself returning home.
Scientists are also scratching their heads over another recent discovery. On the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, they have created the world's deepest hole, extending to a depth of 7.5 miles. At this depth, what they expected to find was a layer of basalt, Earth's most common type of volcanic rock. What they actually discovered was something entirely different.
The hole didn't reach the basalt underlying the granite continents, but to everyone's surprise, they did reach hot, salty water flowing through crushed granite. Geologists are mystified, but the hydroplate theory provides a simple explanation.
Did the springs of the great deep burst forth and flood the entire Earth, just as the Bible says? Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory offers us a plausible scientific explanation for how this may have happened. The hydroplate theory, which supports the story of Noah's flood, says it was the latter. If that is true, what better example of supernatural engineering could one ask for?
Thank you, Eric, for that great animation, and I hope that overview helps you to get an idea. We're going to do that again at the start of the next session, a different video, because as you could tell, this is a far-reaching explanation for many of the features that we see around the world. Let's let Henry Morris introduce Walt from his perspective, and then we'll discuss what many believe is the reason for the parting of ways. Dr. Henry Morris is considered the founder of today's creation movement. He wrote This History of Modern Creationism in 1984. In a section on the Center for Scientific Creationism, he mentions Walt, but first he says there was a first director who was somewhat out of his element. He was a neat Christian guy, but he couldn't handle the science. Then, the same was not true of Dr. Walt Brown, who is a West Point graduate and has a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT. Dr. Brown has enjoyed a very distinguished career in the armed services for 20 years as Chief of Science and Technology Studies at the Air War College in Alabama. Dr. Brown is a very capable administrator and a very knowledgeable scientist. His emphasis has been on large creation seminars, and these have been quite successful. So what's the problem then? Well, here's an objection. Dr. Morris wrote, "There were problems, however. Dr. Brown is strong-minded and independent, and the necessary restrictions imposed by their headquarters in California were a hindrance. Furthermore," that was a very nice way of saying something. "Furthermore, a considerable part of his seminars was being taken up with his own rather detailed model of the geophysical causes and phenomena of the flood. While we were not opposed to such a model, we were not ready to endorse it." So Dr. Morris there doesn't mention the vapor canopy theory. That first objection there is somewhat vague because 2 pages earlier, Dr. Morris had written that a creation scientist has to be strong-minded and independent. He said, because if they're not, they're going to go along with the crowd and they'll never be a creation scientist. So easily, these traits are assets and not liabilities. So there's more to the story, and I've talked with Walt over the years about the behind-the-scenes events of how some leaders turned against him and the hydroplate theory. And of course, it could be because they were clear-sighted and they realized that Walt was wrong. That's a possibility in the realm of possibilities, of course. On the other hand, there are many who think that It was Walt's work exposing what was the beloved vapor canopy theory. Even though today almost all creation scientists now agree with Walt on that, once relationships sour, it's awfully difficult to repair them. So I believe that was the start of the difficulty. The vapor canopy theory. Today, even today, if you ask in a group, who here has heard of the canopy theory, right? You guys, it was like 60%, 70%. That's a significant amount of a group of Christian creationists. So even though it's no longer taught by working creation scientists, there's still the evidence of the tremendous promotion that it had just a few decades ago. Now, where did it come from? Isaac Vail, 100 years ago, he quoted Genesis in support of his theory, though he claimed the book was mythological. So he was not a Christian affirming the truth of God's word. He had his own model of earth history, and it had a canopy over the earth. So he would quote from Genesis chapter 1 in order to get his writings to be considered by Christians. So this is a secular model that some Christians thought, well, maybe that guy's right. Let's see if we could fit it into the Bible. His writings culminated in the book Waters Above the Firmament, which is still available in reprint. Fast forward from ancient history to 1990 at ICR in California, the Institute for Creation Research, Henry Morris's group. Dr. Larry Vardaman, who I've enjoyed meeting, he reported for ICR that if you take a scientific computer model of the atmosphere and you want to put water up above the atmosphere, and that water would come down in Noah's flood and it would supposedly explain all kinds of problems, if you did that, it would be too hot to survive. Man could not survive on Earth if there were more than about 4 inches of water up in the canopy. And 4 inches of water, of course, is not going to give us a global flood. Back in 2003, Dr. Vardaman, still working on this, used very sophisticated United States Air Force software to again model the vapor canopy theory. And he wants the canopy theory to be true, if at all possible. And ICR would love for it to be true, if at all possible. But what he found out is it would not be survivable if there was any kind of significant water up there unless the sun was darkened by 75%, and that's in his paper. He said, now these are the ways we could rescue the theory. If we could figure out how the sun was darker by 75%, or if the upper atmosphere blocks 75% of the sun's radiation, or if the sun was moved 50% further away. And those are called rescue devices. When you have a theory and the theory doesn't work, if you make extreme secondary assumptions, then what you're doing is you're being very creative in how to rescue your theory, but you're really demonstrating that the theory is not correct. So now let's come forward 10 years since that to this year, and John Morris. I was in the audience when John spoke to our group in September when I jotted this down, but I've also confirmed the transcript by reviewing the video at our group's website, denvercreation.org. And John is currently the president of ICR. His father was Henry Morris. His brother helps lead the organization also. Speaking of the vapor canopy theory, Dr. Morris said this: I still kind of hold to it. The geological evidence doesn't support it. The scripture doesn't say it. I guess I'm not a real advocate, although I'd like for it to be true. So there's just an emotional connection, you know. His dad taught the entire world about the vapor canopy theory.
In traditional creation thinking, there was a huge canopy that covered the globe. I'm still open to finding evidence, but we don't have the evidence. And the evidence we do have doesn't allow the canopy. If there were such a canopy, it would cause such a heat problem on the surface that it would be at boiling temperature. and nothing could survive such a canopy. That's the problem, is the heat problem. The more scientists have looked at that canopy theory, there are almost no creation scientists anymore that have studied it that still hold to that traditional view of the canopy that was presented in the Genesis flood and elsewhere. I still kind of hold to it. I see the scriptural hints, but the scripture doesn't say it. And so I would think at very best you got to hold that lightly. The scripture doesn't say it. And the geologic evidence doesn't support it. And so I guess I'm not a real advocate of the canopy, although I'd like it for it to be true.
And there was a tremendous momentum behind that idea that was mentioned in sermons by thousands of pastors. And so for Walt Brown to go public as a leader with Henry Morris's organization, Walt was put on as the director of their Midwest Center. For Walt Brown to go public that the canopy theory is wrong. It's not biblical and it's scientifically implausible. Well, then what happened, I believe, is that Walt took one for the team. No good deed goes unpunished. And once the relationship soured, I think they've been tough ever since. Well, mostly. The influential Christian I mentioned earlier is Rob Yardley. He's the board member with J. Vernon McGee's ministry and for some other amazing outreaches. Rob is in the back, behind the scenes, along with some other real creation heroes, including ICR's Dr. Jason Lyle, formerly the astronomer with Ken Ham, with Answers in Genesis, and Randy Galuza, who just had a major debate with a theistic evolutionist in California. And Rob is going to mention the event that this photo was taken at, and there's another wonderful event when Chuck Smith performed their wedding with his wife, Linda. So let's listen to a brief chat with Rob Yardley about Walt and the creation movement.
Turn up the real science radio. Keeping it real.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. Welcome to Real Science Radio. I'm Bob Enyart. Here at Real Science Radio, we have creationist friends around the country. And one of the guys I've been hearing about for a while is Rob Yardley from California. Years ago, I attended Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, Chuck Smith's church, and I believe Rob Yardley is involved with Calvary Chapel. Is that right? Rob, welcome to Real Science Radio.
Thank you. Yes, sir. I've served on the Board of Elders since 1998, and I'm the church treasurer.
Rob, could you tell me about your background in the creation movement? I think you have interacted with a lot of the major players, ICR and AIG and all these initials.
Yes, very much. In fact, Chuck Smith and I, along with Terry Reynolds from Calvary, went back to the Creation Museum in Kentucky earlier this year, and Ken Ham took us on a tour. It was a wonderful testimony to God's creation. Ironically enough, I just finished last Saturday. We had an event with 2,500 people at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa for ICR.
Rob, you're familiar, I'm sure, as I am, with the competition among creationists. Just like there is in every human endeavor, there's competition. The major groups like Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research, Henry Morris's group. Then there are some creation scientists who are not really in any of the big groups. They work on their own, and one of those is Dr. Walt Brown. I'm wondering if you've observed the competition over the years and what some of your thoughts are about it.
Well, yes, interestingly enough, I had been warned about Walt Brown and the dangers associated with him by many people associated with the Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis. They said his stuff's not worth looking into, and I assumed it was something like progressive creationism or something like that. And then I believe it was at a talk in the late 90s that Henry Morris, as he was mentioning the leading creation scientists in the world, Dr. Henry Morris Jr., the founder of ICR, he mentioned that the greatest living creation scientist in his mind was Walt Brown, which I found surprising. I'd been warned about the guy.
Rob and I went on to discuss Walt's early opposition to the vapor canopy theory, which unfairly led a number of leaders and groups to oppose him. And I say unfairly because today they agree with him, with what he was saying back then. I'd love to collect some audio from Henry Morris in his later years to corroborate what Rob Yardley had recollected. If you know of any, please send it to us at realscienceradio.com. I did find a video clip that's similar, and I'll play that for you in a moment. But it's rather difficult to get someone, a leader of some substance, to speak on the record about relational issues. And we are very grateful that Rob Yardley was willing to do that. So this was just a couple days before Chuck Smith passed away, and the trip they had taken to the Creation Museum was in this year, 2013. Chuck Smith is with the Lord right now, and we're so grateful for his life's work. Well, Henry Morris was speaking with Chuck Smith and a couple other amazing creation proponents and leaders for decades at an event titled Passing the Torch of Creation, sponsored by Henry Morris's group, the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, and we will hear what he has said. He just mentions Walt in passing. So it's not Rob's recollection, that was other events, but I think it's significant because of the nature of this event, and I think that it does confirm the primary point that Rob Yardley was making, that Henry Morris would go out of his way and routinely list Walt Brown among the significant leaders in the creation movement.
What about the future? This is supposed to be passing the torch. I don't know about passing the torch. It looks like it's already been passed. Originally, there was practically nothing except the Creation Research Society and then the Institute for Creation Research. But then out of all that has come literally, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, hundreds of creationist organizations around the country and around the world. There's some national ones, like AIG, Ken Ham's organization. That's sort of a spinoff from us. Walter Brown's organization, he used to be on our staff too, so it's been, and then we have, there's the Alpha Omega Institute.
Rob Yardley's name there, and Calvary Chapel and Copyright Institute for Creation Research. I wish they'd still sell that video. It's a great video. Because of Dr. Morris mentioning Walt as listed with national ministries, when I've mentioned this clip to Walt in the past few weeks, he gets a chuckle out of it because he works in his study out of his home in Phoenix with his wife Peggy. So why would you mention Walt Brown along with some national ministries? Well, I think Doctor's point was that he was saying that among those who can see what's happening, Walt Brown has the impact, that is the influence, and the credibility of a national ministry. For example, the leading creation ministries, they no longer promote the canopy theory, but they do promote something called plate tectonics, or their version of it called catastrophic plate tectonics. So Google will give us a rough idea of how much these organizations themselves are actively promoting their own model and how much traction it's getting online among creationists and even critical evolutionists. So if you Google in quotes like that, to be a little more accurate, catastrophic plate tectonics, Google estimates that that phrase appears on about 8,700 pages. Then we can Google hydroplate theory, putting it in double quotes again, and we see that Walt's theory is approaching about double the web penetration as CPT, with mentions on about 16,000 pages. If you leave out the word theory and just Google hydroplate, it's about triple. So later we'll look at some Google rankings, and we will see that when we look at Google rankings, that'll give us another perspective. This is not rankings, right? This is not like, are you coming in number 42 out of 7,000 on a certain search term. This is sort of popularity. Rob Yardley says that Dr. Morris was not just trying to make amends by frequently mentioning Walt, but rather that Henry Morris was intentionally directing people to Walt Brown's important work. And so that's the background. And now that we have that background out of the way, let's get down to business. In God's Word, Genesis chapter 1. In the rest of this session, we will look at most of the biblical evidence for the hydroplate theory. Our specialty at Real Science Radio and our daily program, Bob and Yurt Live, is to look at the overview in science and in theology, where we focus on the plot of the Bible, the big picture of Scripture. Well, we need an overview to make sure that we don't get lost in the details, which is so easy to do. So let's look at two discoveries that we can make in Genesis chapter 1 that most readers will overlook unless they're intentionally looking for an overview of the chapter. If you read it and you're paying attention and you're very interested, you want to understand, if you don't back up and look at the big picture, there are a couple details that you very possibly will miss. First of all, God does not say it is good on each day of creation. And secondly, there are two different ways that he refers to the word firmament. So you'll see now for yourself these two observations, and I assert that they point uniquely to the hydroplate theory, so let's take a look. On day 1, God created the heavens and the earth and the waters of the deep. On day 3, dry land and plants. Day 4, the sun, moon, stars, and so on. But I just skipped day 2, which is the only day that at no point during it did God say that it was good. And day 2 is controversial. 40 years ago, back in 1973, at the first Bible study I had ever attended after becoming a Christian, some people said, well, let's skip Genesis 1 because everybody knows what's in it. And, oh brother, right? So we didn't agree, we didn't skip. We started with Genesis 1:1. And by the 6th verse, we reach something called the firmament that divided the waters above and below, and we couldn't figure out what that referred to. So here's the text of Genesis 1, and the 6 days are highlighted. Now we'll see something that is easy to overlook. Let's circle where the chapter says it is good and see if God didn't say that on any particular days. Notice there are only 5 red circles. And which day does not get a circle? Well, it's day 2. And why not? Of course, we're not saying that anything bad happened on day 2. We're not saying that. But we also don't want people to think that omitting that phrase there was just an oversight. It was omitted on purpose. Genesis chapter 1 is likely the single most analyzed page of text in all the history of literature. There is a brilliance to its presentation. This certainly was not an oversight by Moses, nor by the Holy Spirit, who inspired him to write the first 5 books of the Bible. The reason that God didn't say it is good at any point in day 2, what had begun on day 2 wasn't yet complete until the next day. And a verse later, we find out that what God had begun on day 2 was now complete on day 3, and we will see this by looking at the meaning of the term firmament. Firmament is from the Hebrew word rakia, which is a noun from the Hebrew verb raka, to be hammered out or spread out as the working of metal into a thin sheet or a plate. From Exodus, we read, they beat the gold into thin sheets. That's raka. From Isaiah, the goldsmith overspreads it with gold. That is gold plated. Easy to follow. God spread the rakia around the earth to divide the waters. God plated the earth, so to speak. Like in plate tectonics, but more accurately, what Walt Brown calls hydroplates, because right here, however God plated the earth, we see there's water under the plate, and so that's why Walt calls it a hydroplate. The ancient cultures, like the Egyptians and others, just as they had a vague recollection of the flood, they didn't quite have it right because they learned about it from their great-great-great-great-grandparents who were the descendants of Noah. So they heard something, but they got it wrong. Well, those same ancient cultures had heard the creation account from their ancestors, but they got it wrong. The firmament that had the waters above and the waters below, they come to think that that firmament was a solid dome. And so atheists to this day will cackle and mock Christians because they say your book, the Bible, says that the sky is a solid dome. And it's not. So you don't have to go any further than the first 6 verses. We know the Bible's false. Well, we realize why they are confused. The ancient cultures misrepresented that, so the atheists take that ancient recollection and they attribute it to the Bible instead of the misunderstanding of the Bible. So rakia comes from the verb raka, but where does our English word firmament come from? Well, we translate rakia as firmament because, well, that word comes from St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and this was way back about 390 AD. He translated rakia as firmamentum, as in the Latin phrase terra firma, the firm ground below our feet. And that obviously refers to something firm, and that's where we got our word firmament from. Now, on this slide, we'll get a better understanding of what happened with these atheists. 3 times in the Bible, God is bragging, so to speak, about creating the world. And the Bible says that God raka the earth. We'll see those verses in a bit. But if the canopy theory was right, if plate tectonics theory was right, catastrophic, then God would raka the heavens, because the heavens are the rakia. But if the Bible says God raka the earth, then that's something we have to take notice of. So the pagan world and other flood models, they would think that firmament refers only to what is over our heads and never to what is under our feet. Genesis chapter 1 uses the word firmament, rakia, 9 times. In the last 4 instances, firmament, rakia, is qualified 4 times right in a row, which seems significant, with the prepositional phrase of the heavens. Let's see that. So here are the 9 times of firmament in Genesis chapter 1. And we have highlighted in red. Notice they are the last 4 with the qualification of the heavens. Not the first ones, but the last 4. And it should be obvious that there's a reason for that. Perhaps are different in some way. And so now we'll continue with our list and we'll try to figure this out. But why in the first 4 instances is it not clarified? And how about the 5th instance? Well, we'll talk about those. If the word always meant firmament of the heavens, if that's what it meant, it would be unnecessary and even peculiar to clarify it like that. For instance, we all know what an automobile is, and it only has one meaning. And if we were writing a little story, we mentioned automobile 4 or 5 times, and then the next 4 times we said automobile of the driving, automobile of the driving, automobile, it'd be like, what? Why are they clarifying? And so that would alert us to, well, maybe they meant something different up top. I mean, that's how dramatic this is. So just as happens with countless words, firmament, rakia, came to have multiple meanings just like crust can mean the outer surface of a loaf of bread, or it could mean the outer plate of the earth. That's the crust. Now, gravity keeps our feet and even the crust of the earth, it keeps us all firmly on the earth. It also keeps the planets and stars where they are in the heavens. It does both, right? Well, firmament, rakia, had its first meaning as the crust of the earth, I assert, that we can see. For God rocketh the earth, and he rocketh the earth above the waters, the Bible says. Rocketh the earth above the waters. That is so significant. So, because he rocketh the earth, that word could also be used for the amazing firmness of the heavens. In the Bible, initially, it was used to mean space, like outer space, when clarified with a prepositional phrase. But then it could be used metaphorically and even lexically to mean the heavens. If we speak of the firmament, the use of the word changes over time, and now it easily means the heavens, and we could normally understand it in the context. Remember that the Bible says in the oldest book, in Job, that God hung the earth on nothing? Wow. Well, the earth's pretty heavy, right? If you look at the gravity of the sun and all. Yet it is as firmly set in empty space as though it were set on a foundation of stone. So when God created the particular kind of space and matter that he made with the heavens and the earth, he thereby brought into existence the laws of physics, including gravity, which to this day is an inscrutable mystery. I mean, maybe someday we'll figure out gravity, right? But we could describe its actions as a field of universal attraction, but we don't know the mechanics of how that field is propagated. But just as firmly as we can stand on the rakia, that's how firmly the stars are held in the sky. So the first four mentions of rakia referred not to the heavens, we're asserting, but to the crust of the earth. Thus, rakia is of the heavens, and also based on the context, and right here in Genesis, in the first four references, where there's no clarification of the earth. Now, atheists hate this because it refutes the atheist dome. They call it the Christian dome or the Bible's dome. It's the atheist dome. The Bible doesn't teach that there was a hard plate up above the sky around the earth. It doesn't. It teaches that there was a hard plate on the crust of the earth, and below that there were waters. Stop the tape, stop the tape. Hi, this is Bob Enyart here. When I said that atheists hate this, as an example, a popular anti-creationist produced a video trying to refute the Bible's teaching that the solid firmament is the crust of the earth. Let's see. So many Bible students, when reading Genesis 1, they come so very close. I've seen their thought process as we're reading the Bible. They come so close to this understanding, it is near them, even on their lips, so to speak. But then they get to verse 8, and it falls apart. And they think, oh, firmament must not have meant what I thought it meant. And why is that? Because they are thinking of the earth after the fall. Whereas Genesis 1 is about God's very good creation prior to the fall, when everything was still an integral part of God's kingdom of heaven, and there was no rebellion. So in verse 8, we read that God called the rakia heaven. And that's where so many students then go wrong, even though they were on the verge of understanding not only day 2, the day 2 of creation, but then also the Genesis flood and the fountains of the great deep. So let's look at that. This is a model of today's earth but with the addition of a thin blue line beneath the crust, almost the scale, it's hard to see, this close-up will help. In a moment, we're going to look at an even closer view of this subterranean sea. And then later in the seminar, in the third session, we're really going to zoom in. Let's take a look at what the Bible says about this. In the beginning, God created the earth, and darkness was on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. In Psalm 136, God laid out the earth above the waters. Do you notice that? The earth above the waters? Well, if the firmament is the earth, then there's waters below and waters above, the crust of the earth. 2 Peter 3:5, by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth was standing out of water and in the water, because for the crust of the earth there's water below and water above, the surface water. Genesis 1:7, God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Now we have another animation, and once again this is from Eric. Thank you, Eric. Let's see what it might have looked like on day 2 when God made the rakia, the earth's plate, the hydroplate. You begin with water on top of the earth, the face of the deep, the waters of the deep. And then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters to divide the waters from below from the waters above the firmament. And by the hydroplate theory, which that's Walt's logo there, the bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep around the whole globe. Here's Genesis 1:7. Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. God's really emphasizing this. This is important to him. Remember that word if that I began this presentation with. If the water for the flood came from beneath the crust that we see on the screen there, then the hydroplate theory is the correct model. It is. Also, the same is true if the firmament of day 2 is the crust of the earth. If it is, then the hydroplate theory is the correct model. I'm not saying that it's right in every aspect, but if either of those two statements are true, the hydroplate theory is true. Now, let's go back to our list to add one more verse. The earth is the Lord's, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. The earth was founded upon the seas. Now God tightly shut the sea into a compartment. Chambers have doors. You know, a compartment could have a door, so to speak. Well, the word door is used to close off some kind of enclosure, typically. Job chapter 38, God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? That phrase, that's a creation statement. The sea bursting forth from the womb. God created the sea. When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. So let's see this animation of the formation of the pillars over 2 days, day 2 to day 3. We're seeing gravitational settling. We'll discuss that in a moment. And this is happening all over the world, forming the surface. At the same time, the pillars are being formed, the dry land is appearing, and God will take the surface and he will lovingly mold it into a paradise for mankind. Now, angels will dwell primarily in God's kingdom of heaven in the realm of his throne room. Here, on days 2 and 3, God is preparing the extension of that kingdom of heaven to the earth. The prophet Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, showing that the rock that became a great mountain that filled the whole earth, that was Christ, basically. we understand studying the Bible with Christ as its central theme. So that was a metaphor. What God said through John the Baptist and through the prophet Isaiah, they were not metaphors. Of his kingdom there shall be no end, for he must increase. Let's see it from Isaiah. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, and over his kingdom even forever. So here's how God was expanding his kingdom during the creation week. He was preparing the kingdom of heaven on earth. Paul writes of the third heaven. God brought him to the third heaven, and he referred to the third heaven because there are two others, right? It's not that Mormonism is true. Don't worry about that. But there's more than one place the Bible refers to as heaven. The apostle in this passage, he wrote to the Corinthians, he called it the third heaven, and he also called it paradise. That's what God created for Adam and Eve. Paul said the third heaven because there is first our atmosphere that we breathe, and secondly the realm of the planets and stars, and third the place of God's dwelling. Now because of the fall, and especially the flood, it's harder for us to relate to why God would have included the surface of the earth with that first heaven, but he did because that was his purpose. Because Adam and Eve were part of his kingdom of heaven on earth. Adam and Eve were not to die to go to heaven, right? We do that. My son Dominic, when he was real young and for like a few weeks, he had a real deep voice. It was weird. And a Sunday school teacher at Denver Bible Church said, Dominic, do you know what you have to do to get to heaven? And he said, well, first you got to die. And, well, okay. That's sort of part of it for us, but it wasn't part of it for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve didn't have to die to go to heaven. They were already there. Jesus spoke of the kingdom that God was building right here on earth. And he also said to the criminal on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. And God will remake this earth again into a paradise as it was for Adam and Eve. And that's why the book of Revelation says, and there will be no oceans. It says sea, right? The new earth will not have a sea. The Greek word is thalassa, which is singular, not plural. And that's a little bit unusual because normally we speak of the seas, not one sea. The new earth will not have the globe encircling ocean that we have today that makes about 2/3 of the earth's surface uninhabitable, because that is a result of wrath and judgment. The new earth will restore the paradise that Adam and Eve had as part of the kingdom of heaven on earth. So it will not have a globe encircling ocean like we have today. There was no globe encircling ocean on the original created earth. The Atlantic and the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, these are the results of the global flood. Passages with creation flood themes can use the word heaven for earth. In Job 26, that's where we read, he hangs the earth on nothing. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters, at the boundary of light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his rebuke. He stirs up the sea with his power. Many passages in the Bible that talk about the flood talk about creation. And they talk about creation, and then they talk about the flood. Constantly, God is including these two as thematic elements that he keeps together, because when he created, he explained that the flood was there as a contingency in case mankind rebelled and became so wicked. The one other passage, it comes from David. He was a warrior and a poet king. What a combination. He had an appropriate flair for the dramatic. Under inspiration, at the end of his life, he compared his own calamity to something like the global flood, when he wrote that the Lord sent out lightning bolts to vanquish the enemy. And in this Song of David, he wrote of the waves of death, dark waters, the channels of the sea were seen, the foundations of the world were uncovered. I mean, that reads like it's a description of the hydroplate theory. Many waters, the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of heaven quaked and were shaken. So during the global flood, when the earth shook and the subterranean chamber was pushed upward by gravity, we'll show that. That's when the pillars of heaven, the foundations of heaven, quaked and were shaken, because God had intended for the earth to be part of his kingdom of heaven, but of course on earth. And so David gave us a glimpse of the deluge in these inspired lyrics. Stop the tape, stop the tape. Hi, this is Bob Enyart again. We'd like to show you another example from the beginning of the creation, when the word heaven was used for the earth. When Adam and Eve fell, that doesn't mean that they tripped, but that they fell from the kingdom of heaven, just as Satan did. From Isaiah and Ezekiel, we read, "You are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer." Yet it also says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God," and here is his sin, "and you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds." Lucifer was on earth. He fell from there, envying those above in the heavens. So he fell from God's kingdom of heaven on earth. As the book of Jude implies, he too was wanting to leave his first estate, which was on earth, his proper domain, and ascend into the heavens. Thus his fall, like lightning from heaven, was when he left God's kingdom of heaven on earth. So depending on the context, both rakia and heaven can refer to the earth. Where the context suggests it, then they can. So God called the earth heaven because it was to be the eternal paradise for Adam and Eve and their descendants inhabiting God's kingdom of heaven on earth. The gravitational settling that we will see in this animation is by the Lord's design. On day 3, God says, "And let the dry land appear." Now that happened, that settling, because of the variation in density and thickness that God created the crust with. God took care to put that kind of thoughtful variation in so much of his creation. This is where the fountains of the great deep were located. This diagram comes from Walt Brown's book, In the Beginning. And now we're ready to reread a verse we just looked at minutes earlier, something that Peter wrote, and we're going to add the next verse to it. The earth was standing out of water and in the water, so the subterranean chamber water and the surface seas, by which those two sources of water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. To review, rakia is the cognate noun for raka, just like Sharia law is from sha'ara, which means to decree. Psalm 136, "To him who laid out raka, the earth above the waters." You see that? I think this is irrefutable that the Bible refers to raka as the crust of the earth, rakia. "Thus says the Lord God, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth, he raka the earth." If catastrophic plate tectonics is correct, if the vapor canopy is correct, the crust of the earth is not a rakia. There are no waters under the rakia, if they're right. If the hydroplate theory is right, the crust of the earth is the rakia, and there's waters on the surface and below. And 2 chapters later, "I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad raka the earth by myself." Wow. So now we can much more clearly understand what was happening on day 2 and the beginning of day 3. And we can understand why God didn't say it is good on day 2, because the firmament had been created, but it wasn't yet complete. Not until day 3, when the dry land appeared. That dry land was so very important for God's purpose, but notice he didn't say, and let there be dry land. He said, and let the dry land appear, because it was a process that was implemented by gravity, the laws that God had created. Okay, so here's a diagram from Walt's book. On day 2, we have the crust, and it's beginning to sink to form the pillars, so that the pillars their bases would be sunk to meet the floor of the subterranean chamber. And on day 3, that's done. So you have the foundations of the earth, and then the dry land appears. And both processes are the opposite ends of the same function. So from Walt Brown's book, we get this concept of the rakia, and we go to the Bible and we see, boy, that sounds like the Bible is saying that. But because we've had other models that came from the secular world in our minds, it's hard to see it. When the Bible says that the firmament divided the waters, it's not using a verb like there was a gradual change in the humidity in the atmosphere. It's using the Hebrew word badal, which indicates a partition, a strong distinction. They were sharply divided. So this rock layer would do just that between the upper and lower waters. When God parted the Red Sea, on that occasion, he also wanted to let the dry land appear, right? For a different purpose. He could have done that in an instant, clicked his finger, and the seas parted. But instead, he did it as an overnight process using the laws of physics. He was involved, but he used the laws of physics. And why would he do that? Because he brought them into existence and he likes them. So let's read the passage, Exodus 14. The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. Now, let's move that over, and we will look at the passage from Genesis chapter 1. It's almost like a parallel passage. We have the similar elements. What did God do? Well, God wanted to divide the waters so that the dry land would appear, and so he used the laws of physics. Now, God had a strong wind come that undoubtedly was supernatural. I don't think Velikovsky's right. People who try to find a natural explanation for every miracle, they miss the point of the Bible. But we see that Jesus turned water into wine. He started with water. He could have just made it ex nihilo and just from nothing, wine. But he likes to use the tools he's already created. So he had a strong wind blow, and by the physics of that scientist study, it was sufficient to divide the waters so that by the next morning, the waters were divided and the dry land appeared. We've pretty much answered all the challenges I get when creationists say, well, the hydroplate theory cannot be right because it says in Genesis XYZ. So we've covered all the typical objections. We've seen that the last 4 references to firmament are different, that the first 5 refer to the crust, and why God said it is good only 5 of the 6 days, because the making of the firmament that began on day 2 was not completed until day 3, and so then God made the plants. In our next session, we will look at some of the scientific evidence for the hydroplate theory. Thanks, guys.
Tune into Real Science Radio. Turn up the Real Science Radio. Keeping it real.
Now for the scientific evidence for Walt Brown's hydroplate theory. We have the book in the back, and I think we've already sold about half of the ones we've brought. So it's just a beautiful book. It's a coffee table book, and I love it with our kids. We're a homeschool family. Part 1 of the book is in bite-sized chunks. Sometimes one page will have 2 or 3 different topics, and just sit down in 5 or 10 minutes. You have plenty of time to read it and talk about it. Really well laid out book. From in the beginning, We will look at just a few items of literally hundreds of scientific observations that point to the hydroplate theory. These observations explain the devastation across the surface of the earth. How did it end up looking the way it does? And on the ocean floors, and the melted outer core of the earth, which undermines the mantle, producing unexpectedly deep earthquakes. Geologists are shocked that there are earthquakes hundreds of kilometers below the surface. Scientific observations explain by the hydroplate theory why we have radioactive elements on the earth. Even though there were none here when God created Adam and Eve, the earth had no radioactive elements. If it did, then with decay, it would have damaged a woman's chromosomes in her ovary, and the baby would have had birth defects or even lethal problems. So the earth was made without radioactive elements. We can now understand why the moon, even though it would have been created flawlessly by God on day 4, why today it's all beat up. And not only is it beat up, the near side of the moon is especially hard hit. And then there are all those meteoroids flying around and that occasionally crash into the earth and can kill people. They're like bullets zipping through the solar system. And then regarding asteroids, Walt Brown correctly predicted that asteroids would not be a single large rock, but that they would be flying rock piles. And that's what they are. And regarding comets, comets are dirty snowballs. They can only last thousands of years, not millions, and yet we have a lot of comets in our solar system, and this shocks astronomers. But the more we learn about comets, the more we find that they consist of minerals that are common here on Earth. So let's start with this overview again, a different overview of the hydroplate theory.
This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically, almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere rose into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
Notice that dark line that wraps around the earth like the seam on a baseball. That's called the mid-oceanic ridge. It's one of our planet's most dramatic and largest structural features. The fountains of the deep were broken up, as the Bible says, all in one day. The crust of the earth fractured and split open around the globe. The water below erupted with tremendous force and flooded the surface. Today, our mid-oceanic ridge is the scar on our planet left over as the earth was recovering from the flood. At 46,000 miles long, it closely follows the path of the rupture phase of the flood when the fountains burst forth. Now, the vapor canopy theory, for example. The vapor canopy theory with water coming down from heaven doesn't explain what would cause this crack around the whole globe. When God made the earth, it wouldn't have had a crack around the whole earth. Plate tectonics tries to explain this with something that some geologists, most, call seafloor spreading at these ridges. So you see the mid-oceanic ridge there in the Pacific. The seafloor is supposed to be spreading from beneath and coming to the floor of the ocean and then spreading. It's supposed to be doing that, except that it's not. And this isn't like evolution. You know how evolutionists say evolution happens, but it's so slow we can't see it. And this is the plate tectonics that the creationists thought a few decades ago, we better put plate tectonics into the Bible, into our creation model, then we'll have figured it out. According to plate tectonics and the way they see the earth moving and with the trenches and earthquakes and all, the rate that the earth is spreading at the ridges, it's sufficient enough that we could measure it if we wanted to using geologic total stations, they're called. You put one on both sides and you measure. And you find out if the distance changes. We're so good at this, we human beings, that a few times a year we shoot a laser beam from an observatory to the moon. We're able to determine the distance of the moon from the earth and that the moon is receding about an inch or so a year. And that's how accurate we can do that over 235,000 miles. Here on the earth, we could measure distances and therefore changes in the distances. So by now, we should be able to quote the famous geologist, which geophysical journal, which articles have reported that they set up these total stations and they measured it. But that's not done. A great place to do it would be Iceland, because you see how the ridge is right there, and it's very accessible. Walt Brown used to meet every Wednesday with one of the fathers of the theory of plate tectonics. His name is Bob Dietz. He's passed away now. Bob Dietz is the one who coined the term seafloor spreading. So for a full year, Bob and Walt would meet at Bob's office every Wednesday, 3 in the afternoon. They'd talk for 2 hours, and then they'd go to see a geology lecture that was scheduled throughout the school year, the academic year. And then once in a while, the two of them would go to dinner with whoever the speaker was that week. Walt brought up that challenge to Dietz, and Dietz was frustrated that in the entire geophysical industry, nobody had ever done it and published the results. And Walt was also frustrated, but said if they would do it, they'd find out that nothing is spreading at these ridges. They're not spreading. There's another prediction that the two men made in one of their Wednesday afternoon get-togethers, and I'll show you that in a moment. These are the trenches in the Pacific. You know, we call the Pacific the Ring of Fire because of all the volcanoes, all the earthquake activity. Well, there's also deep trenches, mostly in the Pacific. The majority of them are there. And how deep are they? Well, Mount Everest is 29,000 feet above sea level. The deepest trench, the Marianas Trench, is 36,000 feet below sea level. So these are deep gouges into the earth. From here, what we're looking at on the left here, this map, by these trenches, if you go straight downward through the center of the earth, from the geographic center of the trench region, you'll be almost exactly in the center of the Atlantic when you come out on the other side of the globe. That is basically the understanding of the hydroplate theory, because when the Atlantic rose up, which we'll talk more about, the Pacific collapsed to compensate for the Atlantic rising. And so these arc and cusp shapes, could you see that? It's real small up in the top left, but you look at the trenches and you can see them a lot bigger. That shape is what we would expect if you had a sphere and you deformed it, it would produce that expected shape. Now, the map on the left comes from Walt Brown's book In the Beginning. I wanted to show you the same pattern just from another source. And so the map on the right comes from the Bigelow Oceanography Lab in New England. They're a major research center. These arc and cusps, if you were to take a ping pong ball and crush it with your fingers, you would get shapes somewhat like this arc and cusp shape. Scientists have discovered a large area, thousands of square kilometers in extent, in the middle of the Atlantic, where the Earth's crust appears to be missing. When I read this story, we report science news on Real Science Radio every Friday. We've been doing science shows on and off on radio and TV since 1991, but every Friday now for many years. When I read this story, I just shouted. I was so just thrilled because every scientist works for Walt Brown. They don't know it, but they work for Walt Brown. Because by the hydroplate theory, as the earth, the rupture phase of the flood, the fountains broke forth, the crust of the earth cracked. The fountains come up all over the earth. They're shooting. Some of the debris reaches escape velocity and leaves Earth's gravity and goes out and eventually forms asteroids and comets. And the rocks are meteoroids. Well, so this is the crack that's forming. As the water is coming up, tremendous pressure, hot. Some of it's called supercritical water. It's coming up and it's eroding the crack. So the water's 10 miles beneath the surface. That means on each side of the crack, there is a cliff 10 miles long, being gouged with water, and that crack is widening, and it widens so much that a huge strip, a swath of the earth on the side of the Atlantic, where this effect took place first, just because of physics. It could have happened somewhere else. But so much of the crust of the earth was removed in the Atlantic that the mantle underneath began to push up. And that's just what happens. If an impactor hits so that we have a crater on Earth, say 400 kilometers in diameter, geologists go and they map it and they take seismograph readings and they find out that the mantle underneath pushes up because the crust is gone. So there's less weight. So because of the rest of the Earth's gravity pushing in, it's called isostatic rebound. The mantle pushes up so that the Earth comes back into some kind of happy stasis, equilibrium. The same thing happens if a lot of erosion occurs in a valley and you remove sedimentary layers, then the mantle underneath starts pushing up. And this can happen within hours and days after a crater impact. So the Earth, it's not the way you think unless you study physics and the plasticity of rock and how rock can flow like putty if the pressures are significant enough. So if the Atlantic is rising up and the Pacific subducting, what would we expect to find? We'd expect to find that in the Atlantic, the crust is gone, and what you find is the base of the subterranean chamber. That base has risen up to become the floor of the Atlantic. What would we expect to find on the Pacific? Well, the mid-oceanic ridge on the Pacific is way to the east, right? It's right along the coast of North America. So for the vast majority of the Pacific, it sunk in. It subsided. It practically collapsed. As the Atlantic is rising, the Pacific is sinking. So the crust that was in the Pacific, where would it be? Well, it wouldn't be gone like in the Atlantic. It'd be buried under the Pacific. Deep below the Pacific, when the crust sunk in, tremendous magma filled up the Pacific basin. And so the crust, it disappeared. It's like down there somewhere. Most crust is, we call it granitic crust. There's a tremendous amount of granite in the crust. So somewhere under there, there's probably big chunks of granite. Okay, so, well, right now we're in the Atlantic, and instead of finding oceanic crust in the Atlantic, it was missing, and they find the Earth's mantle exposed on the sea floor. Marine geologist Chris McLeod, with the School of Earth, Ocean, and Planetary Sciences, said this: "This discovery is like an open wound on the surface of the Earth. Was the crust never there? Was it once there but then torn away on huge geological faults? If so, then how and why?" Why? We know why. God's word says that he judged mankind with a global flood in the days of Noah. How? The Bible and the hydroplate theory tell us how the fountains of the great deep burst forth and they eroded away the crust over the Atlantic. But then what about the crust on the other side of the earth, the hydroplate, the rakia in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean? How about over there? Well, this is what it looks like. In the Pacific, the crust is sunken. If much of the crust of the earth is missing in the Atlantic, and Walt Brown is right, then in the Pacific, it should have sunk. The Pacific Basin is known as the Ring of Fire. It has 40,000 volcanoes more than a kilometer high. It has a lot of others that are not that high. 40,000 volcanoes. It has most of the world's trenches and its deepest. Texas Tech has a major geosciences program. They publish a text co-authored by a Smithsonian paleontologist. And in that text, I'll quote for you, they lambast the scientific community for ignoring the extent to which there is granite crust beneath the Pacific floor. And you could get the references to these writings. Just go to Walt's website, creationscience.com. Real easy to find. Doctors Dickens and Houghton wrote this, quote, "We are surprised and concerned for the objectivity and honesty of science that such data can be overlooked or ignored." They are speaking of the granitic crust that is buried deep beneath the floor of the Pacific Ocean. I will give you an idea of the range of it. This crust has been detected from the Northwest Pacific, you can look on our map, to the Indian Ocean, to off the coast of Chile. The Journal of Geophysical Research reported in one of their seismic studies of the ocean west of Sumatra, and they found this, that there was a tremendous, and I'm quoting, thickness of this layer suggests that it is continental crust. Now that goes back to 1980. And in 1988, they updated it this way. That continental crust forms the floor of the trenches all the way around the bend from Timor, then northward hundreds of kilometers. So the floor of the trenches used to be the crust on the surface of the earth. In those trenches, the crust was collapsed into the globe as the Atlantic was rising. That contradicts plate tectonics. That's why these experts in their fields are outraged that the entire industry of geophysics refuses to acknowledge these things. Their proceedings of their ocean drilling conference, their proceedings say this: there is unequivocal evidence of continental crust at this South Indian Ocean location. So these things are somewhat startling to geologists, because if the kinds of observations that we're making are true, then the theory that they all spent years learning in school is wrong, and that can't be. You can't waste all those years in grad school and all that money learning where the foundation is false. Do you notice the horizontal lines that run along the mid-oceanic ridge, perpendicular to the ridge? You see them? They're so regular. They're called ocean fracture zones. They're worldwide, and along with so many global features of the Earth, they scream out against plate tectonics and against catastrophic plate tectonics and for the hydroplate theory. They remind me of some of the patterns in Marble Canyon and at the Grand Canyon, where millions of tons of rock were removed catastrophically, and the mantle, that isostatic rebound, the mantle pushed up, and you have these tension cracks, because this all happened rapidly, not over millions of years. And so you see them especially perfectly clearly in the Atlantic, right? The mid-oceanic ridge, and there are the ocean fracture zones. They're long scars, and they have a plate tectonics explanation, which seems completely implausible on its face. And then they have the hydroplate theory expectation. Well, the hydroplate theory, as the mid-oceanic ridge rose, the surface of the ridge was being stretched, right? If you take a piece of plastic, stretch it out, and somebody puts their hand in it, it's stretching. So if it's rising in the Atlantic, that rock that was down by the mantle, it's stretching. And if it stretches, it's going to fracture, it's going to crack in two directions. It's going to crack smaller cracks perpendicular to the main axis of the stretch, but then it'll have bigger cracks on the parallel of the stretch. Rock is very strong in compressive strength. If you get a vise and you try to crush a rock, it might be nearly impossible with your vise. But if you could get clamps on that same rock and pull it apart, rocks tend to be weak in tensile strength. They do break apart when you pull on them. So if you took a spring, like a slinky or something, and bent it like this, then the ribs at the top would be further apart than the ones at the bottom. So when the earth is pushing up, you get these fractures. And they're easy to understand. We know why they're regular. We know why they're parallel. And we should know what to look for. If we go in them, we should see what the sediments inside are like, if the hydroplate theory is right. If plate tectonics theory is right, if you went and looked in them, you'd find something totally different. And by the way, at our website, realscienceradio.com/subduction, You could hear just a great show on why subduction zones don't exist. Here's two predictions made by Walt Brown and Bob Dietz. Now, these were not published. This is just a friendly gentleman's bet on one of those Wednesday afternoons where Walt and Bob Dietz, one of the founders of plate tectonics, they both predicted what you would find in these fracture zones. Plate tectonics says they are made by plates that are moving past each other. So the plates are moving parallel to the direction of the fracture zones. So that gives you an idea of what you might find. Is scraping, but that's about it. Walt said, no, that's not what we'll find. If we ever go look, what we'll find is that the deeper cracks will be in the form of trenches. And the more shallow cracks will be like a V. And if there's sediments in them, well, there would be sediments. The sediments will be undisturbed, just like in the trenches, the sediments will be undisturbed. Not millions of years of one plate diving down past another and all the turmoil that would create. Just imagine volcanoes on that plate and then the plate scraping down into a trench and all the turmoil. You wouldn't have even undisturbed sediments as you would have with the hydroplate theory. So Walt Brown said, here's my prediction. And Bob Dietz said, well, the one on the bottom right, there's my prediction. Walt sent an email just during the break, and I said, Walt, how is it that you guys took a bet and then you so quickly had the response? So Walt wrote just today, Bob, in one of our Wednesday meetings, Bob Dietz and I each described our different views of fracture zones. Before our next Wednesday meeting, I went to the Arizona State University's science library. I attended ASU for computer science for a couple years, a tremendous science library there. And I found cross-sectional profiles of fracture zones based on seismic reflection data. When I showed those pictures to Bob, he agreed that my description had been accurate. So what the hydroplate theory would predict as compared to what the plate tectonic theory would predict. And in Walt's book, he references those publications that he looked up so that they could be read today. We say, what's inside the trenches and what are the shapes? Now, there was a double confirmation Walt wasn't expecting. The trenches that are especially long and deep, they are trowel-shaped in the middle, and as they reach the edges, they are shaped like a V. So that was like a double confirmation. And the sediments being undisturbed was a confirmation. Let's talk about the compression event. The fountains of the Great Deep broke forth in the rupture event, and as the water was coming up, the erosion was tremendous, and some of the water and debris left Earth's gravitational field and became the comets, asteroids, and meteoroids of the solar system. But when the mid-Atlantic ridge rose up miles from beneath the crust of the Earth, rose up like 8 miles or so, the Pacific is collapsing inward because of basically gravity. A geologist would get upset. They say, you got to say isostatic rebound. It's basically gravity. Gravity is pushing everything, and when the Atlantic is coming up, the rest of the Earth is going to go take its place. And so when that happened, and there's still water 10 miles beneath the crust, that water took 150 days to be expelled, right? What does the Bible say? It began to rain, and it rained for 40 days, but the waters continued to prevail for 150 days. So the fountains of the Great Deep burst forth, went up into the atmosphere. A lot of it came down as rain for 40 days. When there was so much water blanketing the surface of the Earth, the fountains coming up could no longer get up into the atmosphere. They just came up like a pipe in your basement that broke and it's shooting water. And if you're on vacation, eventually it's not shooting water because there's 2 feet of water in your basement and it's just sort of filling up your basement. And so that's what happened after the 40th day to the 150th day. So there is a lot of water under the crust of the earth. Because the Atlantic was so high and the Pacific collapsed, the hydroplates had a tendency by gravity to slide. And North and South America slid to the Pacific. And Europe and Asia and Africa slid toward the Pacific. When that happened, eventually they ran out of lubrication beneath them. They had to stop. They hit the bottom of the chamber and the continents buckled. They compressed and buckled. So the mountains rose up out of the flood. When the mountain ranges were formed around the world, the major mountain ranges, I'm not talking about more recent volcanoes, but the major mountain ranges, they have sea shells on the tops of all the major mountain ranges in the world, sea life, and they tend to run generally in a north-south direction parallel to the mid-oceanic ridge from which they were sliding away, generally speaking. When that happened, there's a couple other things that occurred that we should mention. When this mass was moving through the center of the earth, there was tremendous melting happening, because you could imagine the friction that occurs in that rock. Not all of it, because some of it will move in entire sheets of rock will move. But on the edges, there's going to be friction and melting. Tremendous amount of melting in the earth, and that melting is what caused today deep earthquakes, because rock is still melting. The outer core of the earth it's liquid rock. It was not that way when God made the earth. Below something called the crossover depth, rock, when it melts, it compresses in volume to about half of its size. Rock compresses by about 50%. So, when the Atlantic rose and the Pacific subducted, the amount of material that has eventually melted, the outer core is the equivalent of 7 moons. During the global flood, the earth rolled. It rolled about 30 degrees, which is why there are all the temperate fossils up in the Arctic Circle. And the axis shifted by about 2 degrees, the axis of the earth. And you can't do that without an external torque, or you could do it with an internal torque. When the core of the earth melted, the core of the earth spins at a different rate as the mantle. It's weird, isn't it? But it does. And so there was a torque that affected the angular momentum of the earth, and it made the earth wobble. And today the earth wobbles. It used to be before the flood, the calendar was perfect. Months were 30 days. The year was 360 days. It was all just perfect. After the flood, it's so well documented in Walt's book, the number of days in the year were changed because of the melting of the core. The moon orbiting the earth in 30 days, it was beat so hard when it was coming retrograde against the earth's orbit, and it was hitting debris going around the sun with the earth in our orbit. So when it was going with the earth, prograde, it wasn't really smacking stuff hard. It was just sprinkled a little. When it came back the other way, it was smacking it so hard that now the orbit of the moon has been affected by the fallout of the global flood because of the fountains ejecting debris and beating up the moon. So, when the Atlantic rose, there was tremendous melting happening. We have earthquakes now hundreds of kilometers below the surface. They shouldn't be there. If the earth is billions of years old, it should all have stabilized by now. But it hasn't, because the global flood happened only thousands of years ago, and the earth is still struggling to come back to equilibrium. When this happened, when the continents slid away from the Atlantic ridge, there was the compression event where they buckled, thickened, the mountains rose up. The mountains were now very high, a lot higher than they are today. And it took centuries for the continents to settle back into the mantle, but they did. But after the flood, the Tower of Babel, and then men are going around the earth, and they're building cities, many by the coast. They're coastal cities all over the world, and they're submerged. From 4,000 years ago, they're submerged. The glaciers melting. That's part of the story. But they're submerged because the continents were settling back in, and as they settled back into the mantle, the sea level rose. So after the flood, for hundreds of years, the sea level was rising. We read in the Bible that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. It doesn't say that the languages were divided or the people were divided. It says the earth was divided. And that's a division. I mean, even today we have that word in the term archipelago. How do you start an ice age? And once it's started, how do you stop it? To get an ice age going, you need a lot of precipitation. To cover much of the northern hemisphere in ice, thousands of feet thick, it needs to snow and sleet and hail a lot. Well, the only way to get that much precipitation into the atmosphere is if you have warm oceans. You need warm oceans to get that much evaporation. But if the earth is warm, you're not going to have an ice age because it'll rain, but it's not going to come down as sleet and hail. If the earth is cold, well, then you could get snow, but there's not going to be enough precipitation to develop an ice age. So to start an ice age, you need warm oceans and cold continents. And what we just described, the fountains of the great deep bursting forth from under the earth, the temperatures were up around 700 degrees. We know the water was supercritical, so we know the upper temperatures of the water. They mixed with the surface waters and they heated, but there was a lot of expansion going on of supercritical water, so it didn't scald the entire earth. Certainly plenty of life was destroyed in the ocean. There's something called the Permian extinction, where evolutionists say it's the single greatest extinction in the history of the world in one geologic event. They're not saying one event like time-wise. They're saying something dramatic changed in the chemistry of the ocean, and that's where they traced this extinction. This is a well-known observation by secular marine biologists, paleontologists. Why did we have an event where most of the species of life in the oceans died in one event? How could that possibly be, Oh, the global flood. Oh, yeah. The global flood destroyed all that life. And so we have the warm oceans, the continents slid, and they stopped sliding, they began to compress, and they buckled upward. They were very high. Leadville, Colorado is a nice-sized town, 10,000 feet above sea level, and it's cold there almost all year long. North America, Siberia, much of Asia, Northern Europe, it's all thousands of feet higher above sea level than today. And over hundreds of years, it settled back into the mantle and sea level rose. That's how you start an ice age. And once you start it, it's hard to stop it because the sun radiates back into space when it hits the ice. You look at a globe and Antarctica, the Arctic Ocean, it's a lot of white, right? Well, sunlight hits and bounces off. You have a dark car, it gets real hot. You have a white car, you could touch it on a sunny day. Once you start an ice age, how do you stop it? Very difficult for atheists to answer these questions. But with the hydroplate theory, we realized, well, the continents were no longer at 15,000 feet. They were coming down. They were at 10,000, 5,000. They settled back into the elevations we have today, like here in Indianapolis, and the continents got warmer. And so there were other factors also, but those are major ones. Here is the amount of water on the earth if you looked at it as a volume. Sea level wouldn't have to change too much. Notice the continental shelves around the continents and how far they extend, and they're very shallow. Here's an animation by our friend, Eric Donovan. And this is what's happening when sea level is rising. Now, before Peleg, the earth was not divided. so that men, as they spread out around the earth after the Tower of Babel, they could go anywhere they wanted to go. And they could get there over land. And they had settlements and tribes and peoples. But then, eventually, sea level rose, shallow land bridges were submerged, and people couldn't just go visit their relatives anymore. They had to learn how to be seafaring people. And so this is based on elevation. When Eric Donovan does animations, he doesn't do like Disney would do and make Tangled, you want the girl's hair to fly around the tree or whatever. And it could do anything. It could defy the laws of physics. Doesn't matter, it's just a movie. But when Eric does animations, he takes the geological data that we have for the surface of the earth, the oceans, and you program that in a computer. I was in the simulation department at McDonnell Douglas Helicopter Company when I attended Arizona State University for computer science. So I know a little bit about simulation. And you put your database geographic data points of the elevations of the earth into your program. And you say, okay, now change the water level. And I want to see, where's the water, where's the land exposed, where's it submerged? We saw how when the ocean levels began to rise, the earth was divided. And we use that word today, archipelago, chain of land, islands divided by water. And Peleg is archipelago. And that's consistent with the biblical usage. So you see these worldwide sediments? This is fascinating to me. Jay Weil, he's a homeschool textbook author, scientist, and I don't at all want to imply that he endorses the hydroplate theory, but we did have lunch together, one of the homeschool dads and I, and Jay Weil here yesterday, and we were talking about the difficulty of eroding the sediments that were deposited during the global flood. It's a huge problem for catastrophic plate tectonics. It's an unsurmountable problem for the vapor canopy theory. They cannot erode that much matter during the flood, that much rock. You have to take rock and with fast-flowing water, pulverize it into grains and transport them all over the continents and then let them settle out into our layers. And the sedimentary layers on the continents are a mile deep all over the world. That's a lot of rock, right? A mile deep. Think about how deep. It's deep. So, if you have a vapor canopy and a lot of the water from the flood came down from heaven, and let's say you energized it so it's coming down with jet packs on and it's just beating up the crust of the earth. And so you've eroded like 10% of what you need to erode for the whole flood for a mile. You got 1/10 of a mile of erosion. Now, where's that erosion? Where is all that sediment going to be? Well, it's in the water. Well, the water will be moving, but how fast is the water going to move? The water has to move really fast, be very turbulent, tremendously energetic to carry a lot of sediment in suspension so that the sediments don't settle. Does that make sense? If you have a flood and a river is really moving, it can pull that sediment far, even boulders, if it's a strong enough flood. If it's a slower flood and you put a lot of mud into it and sand, the mud and sand is mostly going to stay right where you put it, and it just might move gradually. So let's say you've eroded the first half mile of rock that's going to be deposited over a 150-day period. You eroded a half mile of sediments. Where are those sediments going to be? Are they going to all be suspended in water currents all over the earth? It's inconceivable that they could be suspended for a half a year or for 75 days while you're now eroding the next half mile of sediments. So the first half mile of sediments would all come out of suspension. They'd all be deposited on the crust of the earth. Now you have to erode more rock that's a half-mile deep under sediments to get your next half of the sediments. You can't get to it. As you're eroding the sediments, they are blanketing the earth. So the earth will not be further eroded. That's why riverbeds don't continue to go down thousands of feet down and erode deep channels. You know, the Grand Canyon, the whole thing that the Colorado River came in at this elevation, went up thousands of feet, eroded out there, then went down. Rivers don't do that. Why don't they do it in the Amazon and the Nile? And rivers don't do that. They erode, and they do erode, and they cause problems, especially on the edges. But they can't continue to get deeper, generally speaking, because they blanket, they insulate their own floor of the river from further erosion. So we're oversimplifying to describe the flood in two parts, the first half mile and the second half mile, but plate tectonics cannot erode the sediments that we see on the earth from the global flood. Can't do it. The theory is in crisis. The vapor canopy theory cannot erode a mile deep of sediments. If it did erode the first half mile, it's never going to, that's all going to fall out. It's going to be back on the bottom of the water. Then it can't get deeper. Okay, so what we're going to do here in our next segment, we're going to begin to look at catastrophic plate tectonics. And we will see that the description, this problem that is not a problem for the hydroplate theory, it's an affirmation. For catastrophic plate tectonics, it is devastating. It kills the theory. And I think the authors are realizing that, as we'll see.
Tune into Real Science Radio. Turn up the Real Science Radio. Keeping it real.
In this segment, this is our third and last segment of our Global Flood and Hydroplate Theory seminar. We will look at Walt Brown's primary competition today. But first, Walt earned his mechanical engineering PhD from MIT. So that is an extraordinary accomplishment just to get a PhD from MIT. He was serving as an Army Ranger. Note the sleeve insignia, the Army Ranger lightning bolt. The leaf is gold, which signifies the rank of major. So in this photo, he was still Major Brown, not yet a full colonel. When we said earlier, try to Google this, and we saw how popular hydroplate theory was compared to catastrophic plate tectonics. Well, when Henry Morris mentioned Walt Brown among a few national ministries, it really is because of the impact and the influence that he's had is equivalent to a national ministry. I'll give you some examples by doing some Google searches to check out rankings. So this is rankings. If you Google, in quotes, origin of the Grand Canyon, Walt is number 3 out of 700,000 web pages, and that's been consistent for a long time. So, you know, it's hard to beat like Wikipedia or something like that, but 3 out of 700,000 web pages. Oh, and CMI, which is one of the major groups, and I love them, they're number 6. So those are the highest 2 creation sites. Origin of radioactivity. Now, I didn't put that in quotes because Walt's theory is the origin of Earth's radioactivity, but it also applies to radioactivity generally. And if you Google origin of radioactivity, Walt is number 1 out of over 3 million pages. If you add in origin of Earth's radioactivity, which is Walt's part of the hydroplate theory, very few people ask the question, how did radioactivity start on Earth? Because the atheists all assume that it came from supernovas billions of years ago. So they say, what is the origin of radioactivity? It's supernovas, heavy elements. But they don't say, what's the origin on Earth? Because they think the Earth came from stars exploding. Creationists have not addressed the question of why is there radioactivity on Earth when there should be none based on how God made the Earth, because when heavy elements decay, they shoot out like bullets. And those things, if there is a chunk of let's say, coal in a potbelly stove in somebody's home, and there's a little bit of uranium in there, which there is, but very little, but it happens to have an atom that is decaying, that will go right in through somebody's body, and if it hits a chromosome in a woman's ovaries, and then if she ovulates and that becomes her baby, fertilized, then the baby will have a birth defect or die. So when God made the earth, there would not have been uranium on the earth. No uranium, no thorium, no polonium. None of the heavy elements that are radioactive and unstable, there was none. Walt's theory addresses that, and it's brand new in the realm of science, in the realm of thinking Christian human beings, in the realm of creationists. No one has proposed how do radioactive elements appear on an earth that was originally created by God as a paradise. In the DVD version of this, we can include a fabulous video by Brian Nickel, who's a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry. He has offered very generously that we can include those videos in the DVD. Okay, also origin of limestone. Very important issue. That stuff was all eroded from the subterranean chambers. Not all, but the vast majority. And the same is true of the sedimentary layers on the earth. Walt is number 1 out of 44,000. ICR is number 3. Origin of comets. Walt is number 3 of 151,000 pages. AIG is number 4. And then I got the Hydroplate logo flashing because it's all excited. Because if you Google Fountains of the Great Deep, number 2 of 500,000 pages. Number 2. And the image on the top right is number 1. The reason Walt's number 2 is because the image is number 1. So it's really, really exciting. What about catastrophic plate tectonics? That's today's alternative among professional creationists. We're going to begin with a warning from Henry Morris. He wrote this in his book, The Genesis Record, and this warning is not heeded. There's 2 warnings in this quote. It'll be the longest quote I read in the seminar, and he warns about 2 things, and CPT violates both, at least the current version of it, proposed by the lead author. Henry Morris, page 196, he wrote this in 1976. The Bible specifically attributes the flood to the bursting of the fountains of the great deep and the pouring down of torrential rains from heaven. These 2 phenomena are sufficient in themselves to explain the flood and all its effects without the necessity of resorting either to supernatural creative miracles or to providentially ordered extraterrestrial interferences of speculative nature. Like, let's say somebody said comets crashed into the earth and brought all the water. That would be extraterrestrial interference, for example. The breaking up, literally, the Bible says the cleaving open of the fountains of the great deep is mentioned first, and so evidently was the initial action which triggered the rest. These conduits somehow all developed uncontrollable fractures on the same day. Wow. There must have been a worldwide cause. The most likely cause would seem to have been a rapid buildup and surge of intense pressure throughout the underground system. Now, in our video overviews, Walt Brown mentioned tidal pumping, how the gravity of the moon is basically by lifting the crust about 9 inches every day as it does today, and then that crust falling back down with the weight of the crust of the earth, it is compressing the pillars. The earth is 200,000 miles around the surface of the earth, 200,000 square miles about, and there would have been millions of pillars, and every day those pillars are compressing and being pulled up and compressed, pulled up and compressed. That transfers energy into those pillars, which eventually become hot enough to superheat the subterranean chambers. Where does that energy come from for those who are physics oriented? It comes from the angular momentum of the Earth's rotation. So you don't violate the second law. You don't get free energy for nothing. So the subterranean chambers, eventually the pressure and temperature build throughout the underground system until the entire system ruptures worldwide. That's what Henry Morris wrote here, which is uncanny insight. But he could read the Bible, which he did. And he was a PhD in hydraulics. He ran the hydraulics department at Virginia Tech. So he was a sharp scientist. His warning about miracles and extraterrestrial interference, we're going to see that the CPT didn't pay heed to that. Michael Ord is a meteorologist, young earth creationist. He's a dear Christian man. I've spoke to him recently. He and I just agreed we'll do an interview on one of his recent articles. He has a flood impact model, which I think is wrong. He believes that meteors crashed into the earth and that released water from the crust. He thinks that's how the flood was initiated. I love him as a brother, respect him, enjoy him, but I think he's wrong. So his model would violate that warning from Henry Morris, don't call upon extraterrestrial intervention, because the Bible doesn't say that. It's sort of ad hoc. So from Michael's perspective, there's a book called The Flood Science Review. It's 1,600 pages long. Michael proposed his flood impact model there, and 10 scientists challenge each of the models. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, catastrophic plate tectonics, vapor canopy, and so on. Before you present your model, each author had to present the biblical material that uniquely supports your model. How does the Bible say that your model is true? Walt Brown's section in that book is pretty long. I think it's the longest. Michael Ord, here's a quote. He wrote a little bit, but this sums it up on page 1370. There is very little information on the events that initiated the flood in the Bible. Wow. We spent an hour and a half going through what God said about where the waters of the great deep were from, how they were made, and so on. We'll see a little bit more of that at the end of this session. The reason Michael looks at the Bible, he loves the Lord, he knows God's word is true, but he wants to see a flood impact model starting the flood. Meteors crashing into the earth. You don't see that. So from that perspective, the Bible doesn't say much. We made this chart, and we're going to share this online at rsr.org/hydroplate. And this is a chart of biblical material that uniquely supports which flood model. Remember, rakia means the earth, the crust of the earth, the plate of the earth, and the sky. It means both. But some people say, no, it only means the sky. It never means under your feet. It only means the sky. Let's assume for this chart that they're right. If they are right, here's my best assessment. And we're going to put this online so people could add to it, put comments. It's already online. We'll add the link. Here's my best assessment, that the vapor canopy theory gets 3 hits, so to speak. Where God called the firmament heaven, then they're right. I mean, by definition, right? If rakia refers only to the space, then you can't count that for the hydroplate theory, and that's a point for them. The rakia divided the waters under it from the waters above it. So if the rakia only means the atmosphere, then there's like the sea on the crust of the earth, and then there's the vapor canopy above. That would be a point for them. And then finally, the windows of heaven were opened. That sort of fits really nicely with the vapor canopy theory. Then there's still, even if rakia only meant what's above our heads, there's still verses that strongly argue for the hydroplate theory, like where the Bible says that earth was founded upon the seas and established upon the waters. Well, forget about where the rakia is. The earth is on top of the seas, on top of the waters. That means there's water under the earth. So that verse would have to still go for the hydroplate theory. And I'm not going to read all these because we went through them already. But what if rakia did also refer to the crust of the earth? What if that's the case? Then how does the biblical material sort itself out? The vapor canopy theory loses a bit, and here's what we have for the hydroplate theory. And we have gone through these verses, and we have seen that they are specifically describing a structure of the creation and the events of the flood that affirm in a very unique way that the floodwaters came from under the crust of the earth, under the rakia. And so the vapor canopy theory, we still give them that. The windows of heaven were opened. But, as Henry Morris said, when the fountains of the great deep broke forth, that is the event that caused all the other events. So the water comes up, and then gravity, it falls back down as rain for 40 days. If the major source of the floodwaters was from the vapor canopy theory, well then after 40 days the rain stopped. Why did the waters continue to rise for another 110 days? The vapor canopy's out of water. It only had 4 inches anyway. So that check mark there, that's crazy generous. All right, so this comes from Walt's book, The Hydroplate Theory, Key Assumptions. And his main assumption is that there was subterranean water. About half of the water now in the oceans was once under the crust. I think scientifically speaking, he's right to call that an assumption. But how about biblically speaking? Biblically speaking, it's a given. From everything the Bible says, there was subterranean water, and it did flood the earth, and God divided the waters below from the waters above. So this is an assumption, and I think Walt is honorable as a scientist to list it as his primary assumption. There are a couple other assumptions, relatively minor. This is the big one. And if your big assumption is a given because God told you, then that really improves the credibility of your model. And these are the verses that explicitly, that we've gone through, show that Walt's assumption is a given. Okay, catastrophic plate tectonics. And I have the word miracles with it because its mechanisms are based on miracles, as we'll see. We'll quote the lead author, who's a geophysicist from Los Alamos National Labs, and a man I've interacted with over the years. And I do love him dearly. Talked to him a few times, a number of times this year, met him in person this year. They based their model on miracles. This is the model promoted by all the big creation groups for the most part. This is their model. And there's another part of it. It has to do with radioactive decay. You know how atheists and evolutionists look at radioactive elements in the earth and they'll say, well, this uranium decayed to thorium, this decayed to this. So they say, so we know it's been here billions of years. Well, creationists have powerful evidence to refute that claim. And John Baumgartner and these other scientists with ICR and CRS and AIG and CMI, they have done a fabulous job showing that that whole story by the atheist is not true. But they don't know why the radioactive elements are there. They don't know. The reason they don't know is because we had to discover what made them. And I'll try to say it in 3 sentences. It'll be impossible. But when lightning strikes, lightning causes atoms to lose their electrons, and they're squeezed together with such tremendous force, it's called the Z-pinch, that it creates heavy elements. And those heavy elements, they decay within days and weeks, and they're gone. And this is known. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes underground that are the equivalent of a magnitude 7 earthquake, creates about 1 million volts of electricity in a couple seconds. A magnitude 7 earthquake. So lightning causes heavy elements, which is like radioactive elements. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes in the ground, which is well documented. Current research continues, very well documented. So during the global flood, there was more pressure on the granite in the crust than ever since. And so our magnitude 7 earthquake today is nothing compared to the continents being compressed and mountains raising up. There was tremendous force at work on the granite. Granite is made of quartz. This is my fourth complex sentence. Granite is made of quartz, and when you compress quartz or you pull on it, it produces a positive or negative voltage, and that's why all the radioactive elements on the earth, I say all, the vast majority, are in the crust of the continents. It's not under the oceans, it's not in the mantle, it's not in the core. 90% of Earth's radioactivity is in the continental crust. Walt Brown has discovered, not because he's the most brilliant person who ever lived, he might be up there with Isaac Newton, but it's because he had an insight. The insight is the Bible's right when it says that the flood was caused from the fountains of the great deep. They came up from under the rakia. That's it. With that insight, the rest begins to fall into place after a lot of hard work. So let's go to catastrophic plate tectonics and the accelerated radioactive decay. They call that project the RAPE project. The fact that they claim a lot of miracles, well, there are 343 miracles in the Bible, and I know because I counted them one time. There's a lot of miracles. This chart shows how they're distributed, and that comes from my life's work. It's called The Plot, an overview of the Bible. It's my labor of love, and it's on page 228. You know, there, God does a lot of miracles. We know that. But we can appeal to miracles implied in the Bible, but if we have physics problems in our flood models, we should not appeal to miracles that the Bible does not imply. Because if you do, then anybody's idea is equally valid. What's the difference, really? It's just, oh, well, this evidence doesn't support your model. Well, at that point, God did a miracle. Oh, but then this evidence doesn't support it. Well, that was another miracle. Well, how about this evidence? That was another miracle. Well, how do you refute that? People have called me on the air and said, Bob, God told me. I said, wait, if God told you, you should be doing the show, not me. I don't want to do the show. You do the show. Whatever you say, I have to believe it, right? I can't question it because God told you. They'll say, oh, no. Well, then why do you say God told you? So if we're going to say, well, God did it, how do you argue with that? So these are the groups that support catastrophic plate tectonics and its miracles. And these are the scientists who do, and many others, Baumgartner, Austin, Snelling, Humphreys. Humphreys, he's a cosmologist. He and I have decided we'd be doing a show on the Earth's magnetic field and the magnetic fields of the planets that is just shrinking at rapid rates. So here's what John Baumgartner, he's the lead author of CPT. He wrote in CRSQ, which is the Creation Research Society Quarterly. We have one of these left. This is the one I was so thrilled. They published this year my article on Dobzhansky, an evolutionist, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So I got to do a 40-year look back at his claim, and that was really fun. John Baumgartner wrote this: the physical laws were somehow altered by God to cause the flood catastrophe to unfold. So he's saying there must have been a miracle. Here's his miracle. Miracle number one: edges of the supercontinent get 700 degrees colder. Now, a lot of people have heard plate tectonics promoted for years, a lot of creationists, but they don't really know how it works because it's not bragged about very often. But here's the model. You had an original supercontinent, and plate tectonics say that these plates move the speed your fingernail grows, about an inch a year. But they need them to move fast. So to speed it up 1,000,000 times, they say that the edges of the supercontinent, the temperature plunged in a day to about near absolute zero. And that plunge, so it was a little warmer under the surface to start with, but it plunged 700 degrees. That made the rock more dense, and therefore it would sink into the mantle. Okay, more dense rock sink into the mantle. Well, there's a problem with that because when you run the physics and do the animation, the edges of the supercontinent get that cold and they're that dense, and they're not going to sink into the mantle. They're just going to sit there, just very cold. So I wanted to establish each of these. So this is from 2002. In the Journal of Creation, Dr. Baumgartner wrote, an initial temperature perturbation is required. That means it got colder, right? We're not scientists, he is. An initial temperature perturbation is required to initiate motions within the spherical shell domain that represents the Earth's mantle. For this, a temperature perturbation of minus 400 degrees Kelvin to a depth of a few hundred kilometers is introduced around most of the perimeter of the supercontinent. So that is one of our leading creation scientists saying, here's how I believe the flood happened, the flood we read about in the Bible, the edges of the supercontinent got really cold. That's very ad hoc. That's just inventing ideas. Miracle number 2, the Earth's mantle gets mushier. Because it gets real cold and nothing happens. So it's colder and denser, but if the mantle is mushier, the viscosity changes, the edges will start to sink. But maybe they were mushy to begin with, and after the flood they got firmer. Either way, it's a miracle. And that's from 1990, Proceedings of the Second International Creation Conference. The mantle's viscosity at the time of the flood was lower than at present to permit rapid sinking of the lithosphere into the mantle. Now we have miracle number 3. God removed the heat of accelerated radioactive decay. So they see all these radioactive elements in the crust. They know the Earth is young, so they say somehow the radioactivity sped up, but how? They admit they have no idea. Why is there radioactivity in the crust? No idea. Would God have created radioactivity in the crust? Not likely. It was a paradise. There'd be no birth defects. But they say if there were all these radioactive elements, there were not before the flood, but if there were, and they decayed rapidly, billions of years worth of decay rapidly, where atoms are shooting out particles, and those atoms become different elements then, and that they might shoot out more. Every time that happens, it produces heat. And all that heat, if it happened during the flood, it would melt the crust of the Earth, or nobody could survive. So they say they have a heat problem, and they very much openly say that God solved the heat problem. Now, many of these scientists will say Walt Brown's theory can't be right because it has a heat problem. Well, how could you claim miracles for your own heat problem and then deny them to anyone else? That's not fair. That's special pleading. So here is the RATE project published by ICR, 2005, the heat problem. God was directly involved in all of these events, so it is possible that he employed some supernatural process which does not occur today or cannot be detected. That's a miracle to remove the heat. That is also said by Don DeYoung. He's the president of CRS, publishes that journal I just showed you. He spoke at our church last summer at Denver Bible Church, the church that I pastor. He and his wife were there. We had a wonderful time with him. But he wrote this in his book, Thousands, Not Billions. Most biblical miracles require a temporary suspension of basic natural laws. Heat dissipation, that's the subtitle. Because the crust of the earth did not melt during the flood period, it is proposed that an enormous expansion of space, 20-fold times or greater, occurred during the flood event. Now, some of the RATE team, scientists, have proposed this. Russell Humphreys has written this up as a serious proposal. Don DeYoung should say that was proposed, but it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for us as creationists to say, well, our model has a heat problem, so the size of the universe expanded by 20 times in order to take the heat out of our floodwaters. That's not a reasonable, it's not a defensible, it's not justifiable. It's ad hoc, it's a rescue device. The Bible doesn't imply it, If it did happen, it would remove the heat where the earth was too hot, and where the earth wasn't too hot, like on the ark, it would freeze it to death. You wouldn't just expand the universe, you'd have to tweak that heat loss at every point on the earth. There's Don's book, Thousands Not Billions, a great book. I was involved in their Thousands Not Billions conference in Denver some years ago, just in promoting it and going to it. It was just great. So some disagreements, but overall, these guys, they love the Lord and they point people toward a young earth, a global flood, and God is our creator. So we're all on the same team. This is the photo from earlier. These are the scientists who are part of the RATE project. And like I said, for the most part, they either will strongly oppose the hydroplate theory or, to the best of my knowledge, just disagree with Walt and certainly not endorse the hydroplate theory, but they'll endorse CPT and the RATE project. So, miracle number 4, extraterrestrial intervention to transport sediments. Now remember what we said earlier? However the flood actually happened, it has to erode enough rock that it could be deposited on the continents 1 mile deep. Imagine a mile deep of sand and rock and debris to cover just Indianapolis, 1 mile high. Then start going to Martinsville and, just start spreading out. Get out to Warsaw. Think of how much rock that is. Go to Colorado. Cover the North American continent. Cover all the continents a mile high. That's a lot of rock. If you are eroding that rock because it's raining from the canopy theory, well, real quickly you're not going to be able to erode anymore because all that sediment is going to fall back down. And so you'll just be stirring up the bottom. Maybe at the bottom of, let's say, the floodwaters, there's a 1/4 mile thick of sediments. Let's say vapor canopy was right, and by some miraculous way, it eroded a 1/4 mile of sediments, which is inconceivable. But say it did. Well, how are you going to erode the next 3/4 miles of sediment? You can't do it. If you eroded a 1/2 mile deep of rock into grains of sand, enough to cover all the continents, then all that would have to be suspended in the floodwaters, circulating through the earth while you're eroding the next 1/2 mile. It's not possible. So they need miracles, the equivalent of miracles, to erode the sediments. Now, ask yourself, is that reasonable? For God to judge the earth, did he need to erode a certain amount of sediment, or did he need to drown mankind? The floodwaters killed everything that has breath in its nostrils on the face of the earth. So all mankind, except for Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and daughter-in-laws, everyone was killed. Did it matter if we had a 1/4 mile of sediments, or a mile of sediments, or 5/8 of a mile? It didn't matter. So why would God need to do miracles just to erode sediments? Because your flood model can't explain where the erosion came from. So if CPT can't explain it, the vapor canopy theory has no way of explaining it. And once you erode it, you have to deposit it. And that takes tremendous turbulent flow, tremendous energy. So where does all that energy come from? With Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, it comes from gravity, which is the first actor pushing down on the subterranean chamber and forcing the water up with tremendous force. But as that's happening, the lightning in the crust, the granite crust of the earth, is producing a sea of neutrons, radioactive elements, and the earth has become basically like a nuclear engine, the subterranean chamber, producing tremendous energy. And then the supercritical water, once water gets a certain pressure and temperature, it no longer behaves like a liquid. It doesn't behave like a gas. It behaves like something else. And it is shocking, the things that it's able to do regarding temperature and erosion. And this is well documented. It's used in industry. So the hydroplate theory is just a recipe for how you erode all the sediments on the earth. It's obvious. They came from the subterranean chamber, and when the water was coming up, they ruptured 10 miles high with cliffs on each side eroding away. So the erosion didn't come from the surface of the earth. You can't do it. You can't erode that much from the surface. So John Baumgartner proposed this. He did this summer in Pittsburgh at the 7th International Conference on Creationism, one of the greatest events I ever have gone to in my life. I was there at John's presentation. I read his paper. So he acknowledged using the software. Now, he is one of the world's better known geophysicists. He is a scientist who's worked at one of our national labs, Los Alamos, for many years. He created a software program called Terra for being able to study the interior of the earth, even though we can't get down there. And that's used by geologists around the world. He's brilliant, and he's a Christian who loves the Lord. So using his software, he said, catastrophic plate tectonics can't erode all that sediment, and it can't carry it and deposit it. So it has to be something else. So he checked to see what if there were meteorite impacts. Could that do it? And he said, when you look at the earth, and it can't do it. We can't call on meteorite impacts. How about earthquakes creating tsunamis? He said, no, that doesn't do it. What if the poles flipped? What if that happened? Doesn't do it. We can't get that water turbulent enough to erode a mile deep of sediments and then transport them. We can't do it. So he wrote this paper, and he said, here's how we can do it. It is proposed that 6 near encounters with a moon-sized body, this moon-like body in outer space, the Earth's gravity caught it, it went around the Earth 6 times, and then it flew away. And that's where you can get the energy to erode all the rock and then transport it. And I think on its face, that is utterly unreasonable. With all the other miracles, now we have this moon thing. So he says the tide that would be caused would be 2,500 meters high. That's a 1.5 mile high tide. That's pretty serious. Presumably an interaction with some other body caused it subsequently to break free of the earth. Plate tectonics model is in meltdown. It is not a valid biblical model for how the global flood happened. It's not a valid scientific model. It's somebody, like the vapor canopy theory. We took a secular idea, try to fit it in the Bible. And it caused decades of lost opportunity by Christians who really couldn't answer the hard questions of people asking. So we have, for today, for you guys, we created an animation of this process of the Earth capturing this moon. And our point in showing this is to drive it home the rescue device needed to support Answers in Genesis catastrophic plate tectonics. This is what's needed based on their lead author. Now, John Baumgartner doesn't work for AIG, but AIG promotes catastrophic plate tectonics. All the big groups do. So we want to drive home the seriousness of their inability even just to erode the rocks during the flood. Catastrophic plate tectonics, erosion, and deposition problems are this serious. Just to erode flood sediments, an extraterrestrial intervention. Different cycles create close encounters between the object and the moon, as we'll see. Here comes the first near miss. The bigger point, though, is the admission that catastrophic plate tectonics cannot erode the world's flood sediments. Second near miss. The creation movement, AIG, ICR, CRS, CMI didn't realize what it was getting into. We can see the wisdom of Henry Morris in the Genesis record, warning creationists, do not resort to miracles of convenience, nor extraterrestrial events, because the Bible attributes the flood to the breaking forth of the fountains of the great deep. These 6 orbits illustrate how far people will go to defend an idea that is evidently false. By forcing evolutionary geology into Genesis, creationists have created many problems and have whitewashed the errors of plate tectonics. And thank you, Neil Copley, for that music. That's a commitment to a model. That's what that is, right? And we human beings, when you write a short story and you ask people to read it, and they say, well, did you ever think of changing this part here? And you're like, what are you talking about? That's my baby. You want to cut off his ears? You can't change my short story. So when you have scientists who've studied for years plate tectonics, and then they take it and they propose, this is how the global flood happened. It's plate tectonics sped up 1 million times. And then the more they study it, they see, well, it doesn't work here, so we need a miracle. And then it doesn't work here, we need a miracle. It doesn't work here, we need a miracle. Now, here, oh boy, it's weird to say God did a miracle and he eroded all the rock. So you have an extraterrestrial intervention rescue device. So we think that it's time to put to rest the catastrophic plate tectonics theory, like IE6. They really did. Casket. Microsoft sent flowers. It was a tech firm in Denver. It's time for CPT to be put to rest. It is taken resources from the creation movement that could have been used to better understand the Bible and the world that we live in and to answer people's questions. And that is lost opportunity. Economists call that the opportunity cost. How much closer could we have been if we had not gone down the wrong path of vapor canopy and the wrong path of CPT? At the conference in Pittsburgh, I asked Dr. Baumgartner a question. He responded. He's just so gracious to me. He was on the kids' radio drama program called Jonathan Park Adventure Series. And one of the episodes, our kids have listened to all the Jonathan Park series. They're so great. They teach kids about creation and how to expose the misinformation from the evolutionists and the atheists. And they're so entertaining. On one episode, they needed a real scientist to help the kids, Jonathan Park and his friends. They were invited to a radio show. So they said, well, could we bring a scientist with us in the program? The drama, radio drama, they said, well, sure, you could bring a scientist. So they're like, well, we're going to get John Baumgartner to join us. And so John played himself on this episode, which is so great. But here I was able to ask him about this. And at the ICC, I don't know how many people were there, hundreds of people, scientists from around the world. It's not a pro-Walt Brown forum. It's CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, and then there's some Walt Brown rebels like me walking around trying to figure out, what trouble we could cause. And so in the Q&A, John had just presented some body orbited the Earth 6 times. So I went up in the Q&A and asked him a question.
Bob Inyart, Real Science Radio. Dr. Baumgartner, a question about mechanisms. So if we have planetary body or bodies with near misses, it seems you've put the ICC on the horns of a dilemma where either we have Velikovsky or Walt Brown, because I'd like to ask you if you considered in your mechanisms if a subterranean chamber collapsed about a mile deep and the continents then fell, then a possible mechanism could be the gravity that causes that water to begin flowing because of the continents crushing the subterranean chamber. I wondered if you considered gravity as a mechanism. Thank you.
Okay. As I pointed out in a few places, that problem of the hypothesis of these subterranean chambers of water, even though there's scriptures that one can well suspect might be pointing that direction, I find it very difficult to imagine how those could be sustained for very long. If basaltic magma can find its way out easily today, then water that has even lower density than basaltic magma almost certainly could find its way through cracks, even from just the daily tidal motions, to escape. That kind of a configuration is very unstable. I personally think that's not a trivial objection, a trivial problem. I believe it's a serious problem for Walt Brown's hypothesis.
Dr. Baumgartner, he answered my question without answering it. I said, did you consider gravity? Did you model that? If the continents did crush a subterranean chamber, what kind of energy, how turbulent would the water become? You know, we have a little earthquake and a tsunami that kills 100,000 people. Well, what if instead of a little earthquake, what if North America fell 3/4 of a mile down toward the mantle? How much energy would that release on the crust of the earth? Quite a bit. And that's only part of the energy of the hydroplate theory. And so he didn't model that, and that wasn't a surprise. But then he gave his favorite objection to Walt's theory. He said, if you have water 10 miles beneath the crust, that water is going to find its way into cracks, and it's going to come up, crust will fracture, and you'll have the flood like on day one. Or on the first year after God made the earth, it's going to escape. It'd be unstable. And he said, today, magma finds its way up through cracks. Well, today, the crust of the earth is all fractured. There's cracks everywhere. When God made the earth, he would have made it perfectly. The moon would not have been all beat up like it is. The moon is beat up mostly on the near side because of the debris that was ejected from the earth. When God made the earth as rock, as you go deep below the surface, the pressures become so intense that a term plasticity, rock begins to flow like putty. And the pressures are so great, if you think about it, when you're 10 miles below the crust, you have the weight on top of you pushing down. You have what's below wanting to go up, if it could. And you have, because of gravity, the rest of the sphere of the earth around you is pushing in on you. The pressure is enormous. A crack is not able to open up at those pressures. A microscopic crack would have to open up for then water to come out of that subterranean chamber and begin to break through the crust. What God did when he made the subterranean chamber is he created this hydraulic system which was brilliant, and he fine-tuned it in such a way that it functioned perfectly the way we see fine-tuning in every other aspect of what God made. The fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe stun the atheist. They are stunned by it. And how is everything so perfect? If you study the water cycle, you know, young kids in school, homeschool, they study the water cycle. Scientists have written entire books on the brilliance and the uncanny perfection of the balancing of all the constants and the physical forces that are necessary for us to have a water cycle. Who would have thought it, right? It evaporates, comes down. And so for God to be able to build the earth with waters under the crust that are waiting there in storehouses for judgment if mankind turned against him, God can do that. And the physics don't say that he couldn't have. The physics are reinforcing the fact that this would be a stable construct for God to design the earth, not only with the water, but with the pillars. the foundations of the earth that were sunk into the bases over days 2 and 3. So these sediments, which is typical, right? Drive toward Grand Junction, Colorado, you see this stuff for hours. You drive anywhere outside of cities, well, you can't be in the plains really. You've got to be near the mountains. But you see this stuff all over the world. And so CPT can't explain the erosion of the rock, the sediments in those layers. It can't explain where it came from without appealing to miracles. I've mentioned supercritical water. That's when water gets hot enough and enough pressure, and it behaves very different than a solid, liquid, or gas. Well, at this conference, Stephen Austin said this, and I've been noticing this for 10 years. Our creation scientists, they make so much progress when they see what Walt Brown has been doing, and they say, oh yeah, let's try that. Stephen said, supercritical water is very friendly to the creationist view. We should all look for this and how it behaves at depth. Deep below the crust of the earth, supercritical water will help explain what happened during the flood. This is Walt Brown, 7 years earlier in his book, in the beginning on his website. During the flood, supercritical water accelerated out of the chamber. This tremendous acceleration expanded the spacing between water molecules, allowing flash evaporation, sudden cooling, and erosion, and so on. So Walt has been on the cutting edge of the creation movement for 30 years. But it's because I think of the souring of the relationships early on, and then it's the not invented here syndrome. Okay, so that was the 4 miracles, and then we have the anti-miracle, which is maybe the saddest part of all. At the ICC, leaders of catastrophic plate tectonics, 2 in particular, were in front of a plenary session, and we reported this on our Real Science Radio show /ICC, easy to find. And they said that the moon had to be created before day 4. And that was tragic because the Bible couldn't be more explicit. They're young earth creationists, and they say, we believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old, but the moon had to be created before day 4. And that is devastating. It's too much of a commitment to your model and insufficient commitment to the scriptures. They don't know what is the source of radioactivity. They admit that. So they don't know why is there radioactivity on the earth and the moon. And how would they correlate? And if you had all that radioactive decay, what happened to all the heat? They have so many unknowns, and to take all those unknowns and conclude this is not reasonable. And I was so proud of Danny Faulkner, the astronomer for AIG. He used to be the astronomer, well, for years at North Carolina State University, one of their professors in astronomy. He immediately responded. And he said, John, I feel like I need to rebuke you. This is in front of like 400 people. He said, because the Bible clearly states that God made the sun, the moon, and the stars on day 4, and we have been fighting theistic evolutionists and progressive creationists for decades, and they say, oh, God made the moon and the sun and the stars before day 4, but they just became visible then. And Danny said, this is not a commitment to our fundamental principles. But it's another example of how far we will go in service to a model, to our ideas. Last thing, I'm glad to use this photo because it communicates John to be as friendly as I know him to be. He said something that I wrote down when he said it at the conference. He said, Henry Morris visited the church I was attending many years ago to promote creation in the flood, and I decided to focus on problems in earth science. That's a great thing. And then he said, I had an epiphany. We must figure out how to fit plate tectonics into the Bible. That's a verbatim quote. That is not a safe approach for figuring out what does the Bible say and how might God have created the earth and how did the flood come about. It's not a model that raises confidence. And it's exactly what happened with the theistic evolutionists. Now, they were worse because on the face of it, theistic evolution undermines the authority of the Bible. Plate tectonics almost does the same thing because it happens over billions of years, but John said, but we speed it up 1,000,000-fold. So it's biblical. And they call it catastrophic plate tectonics. Is it really catastrophic in the biblical sense? You know, there's a flood. They said it was a flood of biblical proportion. Well, in the biblical sense, if CPT cannot erode the sediments for the flood, is it even catastrophic? It's not even catastrophic. It's not catastrophic in biblical terms. And scientifically, it's not catastrophic enough to cause the phenomenon of the flood. And I don't believe it even has a reasonable answer to where did the water come from. Just because the edges of the supercontinent start diving into the mantle, where does all the water come from? To bury the mountains. The water comes from under the crust. We've already discussed how in radioactive decay, there's an alpha particle, and that thing will cause birth defects. And that's all over the world today. Thankfully, if you look at the crust of the earth, the crust of the continents, that's where all the radioactivity is, mostly. But it's relatively rare, thankfully. But it is on the continents. And God didn't put it there. Atheists say the funniest things. We interviewed theoretical physicist, emphasis on the theoretical, Lawrence Krauss from ASU. He's best friends with Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, and the Discovery Channel made a special out of it. So we created a little spot on our website, rsr.org/Watsa. Because when you talk to an atheist, evolutionist, and you use common terms, things that you could find around the house, you know, they say, what's that? What's that? What's that? If you say evidence, they say, what's evidence? If you say, well, isn't this a problem? They say, what's a problem? Isn't it anything you say? So we had this from Eugenie Scott and Michael Shermer and Aaron Ra. Richard Dawkins does this. That's probably where Krauss got it. But Krauss really took the prize, the record, for the most in the shortest amount of time. Krauss is an atheist, so here's what he said. So the creationists who've been saying for decades that Neanderthals were people have been confirmed. DNA doesn't lie.
What do you mean people?
People, human beings.
I mean, you know, our DNA is within 97% the same as an amoeba.
So many atheists and evolutionists now saying that perhaps...
I don't know what you mean by atheists and evolutionists.
Some people are evolutionists, some people are not.
What do you mean by evolutionists?
People who believe molecules to man evolution.
Well, let's stop a second. I don't even use the word believe. Scientists don't use the word believe. I don't believe anything.
The best-selling atheist authors, to me, seem...
Well, they're all atheists, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know what you're talking about.
They're all atheists.
Essentially, the first approximation all scientists are, yeah.
Now, are you open to the possibility that Darwinism is false?
What do you mean Darwinism?
That is the way it goes, talking to evolutionists, atheists, pro-aborts. That's what it's like. Because they're afraid of the discussion. That's called obfuscation. So with all that, there was one point where Lawrence Krauss agreed with me that radioactivity and granitic crust go together, like hand and glove, like peanut butter and jelly, like Peyton Manning and the Broncos. You know, I had to get that in there. I know. When you guys beat the Broncos, was that 3 weeks ago? Our favorite sign was somebody in the stands. It said, "We love you, Peyton, just not tonight." Okay, so he agreed with me on this point on radioactivity, which he's so disagreeable, and he's a leading theoretical physicist in the world. He might be in the top 10 maybe for popularity-wise, And so for him to agree is significant.
Study. So again, once again, you
all right.
have to know what you're talking about.
On this, I think I know very much what I'm talking about. 90% of the Earth's radioactivity is in the crustal rock of the continents.
That's a true statement.
Okay. So, finally, right? So why is it there? If those heavy elements were formed in supernova, Larry Krauss blasphemes Jesus Christ when he says, forget Jesus, a star died so you could live. That's what he says.
So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway, he's great.
Now, he's wrong even scientifically because this year, the journal Nature has published that we now know that supernovas can't create the heavy elements. Everything heavier than iron, which means most of the elements, they can't make them in supernovas. There's not enough energy. There's not enough temperature. There's not enough pressure. There's not enough neutrons. And they look at the light. They're not making heavy elements like they thought. We've all been told that stars explode and they make all the elements that are in our bodies. Well, they can only make the elements up to iron. So why are all those elements here? Chemical evolution cannot answer where do the heavy elements come from. The National Academy of Sciences, which is America's most prestigious body of atheistic Darwinist scientists, they published the 11 greatest questions for physics just a few years ago. And question number 4 or 5 was, how did heavy elements form? They don't know. Wouldn't that be a shock to most people who watch the Discovery Channel and listen to Science Friday on NPR? They'd be shocked. They thought they figured it all out. Rate heat problems solved by miracles, that's the claim, right? Yeah, but after the flood, the Earth wasn't just the right temperature, like a Goldilocks, just the right temperature. It was way too cold. Glaciers, millions of square miles of frozen muck called loess or lurs. The Ice Age. If God was going to remove the problem of the heat, well then why did he remove so much heat? He could have done it just perfectly. So the Bible doesn't say God gave a flood and then he gave an ice age to really punish mankind. No, he gave a flood. The ice age was a result of the consequences of the flood. After the flood, the world wasn't too hot, but too cold. So look for a flood model with processes that systematically remove heat. The vapor canopy theory, it doesn't remove heat. Catastrophic plate tectonics, it creates a lot of heat with the accelerated decay. It doesn't remove heat. The hydroplate theory removes heat. The fusion of heavy elements, when lightning creates heavier elements, this has been done in the lab by scientists thousands of times. They produce electric currents that are like lightning bolts, tremendously finely focused on a micro dot. And the temperature gets so hot, we talk about the sun, how hot that is. This gets, in the laboratory, 640 million degrees for like a millionth of a second. And it produces, out of normal elements like iron or gold or other elements, it produces uranium and thorium and polonium and radon and all the heavy elements. It produces all of them. They've been doing this thousands of times, and it's a stunning advance in nuclear physics to realize that when you have sufficient electrical current focused in a Z-pinch way, you create heavy elements. And not only do they create heavy elements, in the Earth, there's a certain amount of this element, a certain amount of that element. There's 60 heavier elements, heavier than iron or so. Well, they produce those elements in the lab by accident in about the same proportions that they exist in the crust of the Earth. So that is just astounding evidence that those heavy radioactive elements came from the global flood and the electrical discharges in the crust during the flood. So fusion of heavier elements, oh, by the way, when that happens, the whole lab should melt down, you know. But they say the process is adiabatic. The process, it doesn't melt down the equipment, it absorbs heat. Because when you make a uranium atom from smaller atoms, because their electrons are stripped away and the nucleus are pushed, squeezed together so tightly, it overcomes the Coulomb force that wants to shoot like particles apart. Protons, like you have an atom, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. Why doesn't it fly apart? It wants to by the electromagnetic Coulomb force, but the strong force holds it together. And when the atom nucleus becomes too big, it's real heavy, like uranium, the nucleus is so big that the strong force can't hold on to all the protons and the neutrons. The Coulomb force then, because the distance is so great, they measure it in barns, the distance is so great that the strong force loses hold of some protons and neutrons and they shoot out. And that's why we have radioactivity. So in lightning and in this Proton 21 laboratory, they focus this electrical current on pieces of iron or whatever they use, and as long as it's relatively pure, and they produce all these heavy elements. And they call it cold repacking because it takes energy to make those heavy elements. So in a nuclear power plant with fission, we are generating a lot of heat. If you're using fusion and you're building heavier elements by smashing atoms together, you are absorbing heat. So you take all that radioactive decay that the RATE team and CPT thinks they have a problem with, and most of it went into the creation of Earth's radioactivity. The heavy elements were made with that heat energy. There's more to the story, of course. Supercritical water expansion, converting energy, heat energy into kinetic energy by launching the fountains of the great deep through the atmosphere and the rocks and the water going out to become the comets and asteroids. That also removed a lot of heat. Kinetic conversion of heat to kinetic energy and supercritical water expansion jetting into space. Okay, last thing. Natural, God-made subterranean chamber. And we went to Istanbul, our Bible tour of Turkey, and we saw a man-made subterranean chamber called the Basilica Cistern. We thought, wow, that's a pretty good model for the subterranean chamber the way the Bible describes it. It doesn't look the same, but it has all the same parts. So I just wanted to show you where this is. In Istanbul, there's a church there, Hagia Sophia, and down here, 3 blocks away, is one of the largest mosques in the world, the Blue Mosque. We went in there. That mosque was built 400 years ago. The church was built 1,000 years before that. And Hagia Sophia is so enormous, you could put the Blue Mosque inside the church. That's how big it was. And it was built 1,000 years before. Since the Muslims took over Turkey, Ottoman Empire, so the Arabic signs, they put them up in the church. But they did leave the Christian mosaics. We use this on, in fact, we might have it on the table back there. Our Bible studies in the Gospels, we use this mosaic of Jesus from back then, from 1,400 years ago. But at the same time the church was built, there was the cistern that was dug under the streets of Istanbul. And this is a picture of it. This is not a church. This is an underground chamber to collect rainwater. We're going to look at this and just use it as a model of what we saw in the Bible about how God made the underground chamber. We have the pillars that the Bible speaks of, and they didn't look like thin columns like these, but we saw from Eric Donovan's animation approximately by physics what they would have looked like. And the beams of the upper chambers would be where the pillars are connected horizontally to the other pillars. In the upper chambers, each one would hold 100 billion gallons of water at the top of the subterranean chamber. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And in the Hebrew, those bases sunk, it's the same Hebrew for when, like, Solomon built the temple in 1 Kings, and he put the columns, they had their capitals at the top, and at the bottom they had their bases. It's the same architectural terminology. We saw how it was a 2-day process, so literally the bases were sunk into the foundations. He established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever and ever. The earth is the Lord's. He has founded it upon the seas, established it upon the waters. The earth, I set up its pillars firmly. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. You who laid the foundations of the earth, you covered it with the deep. This clip is not an endorsement of the upcoming film from Paramount, but it might help us to envision the mechanism that the Bible describes, with the primary mechanism of the flood, as Henry Morris points out in the Genesis record, which is not rain falling down, but the fountain shooting up.
Beginning of everything.
Did you see the glimpse of that mountain in the background when the ark was in the waters? Well, if the water came from up above, then that's it. The rain stops. You're not going to cover those mountains. But the water prevailed for 150 days. It kept rising after the rain stopped. That tells us that the vast majority of the water came from below, not from above. By the way, while that's an idea of what the flood was like, very likely that Hollywood may include sexually seductive scenes. So it'd be wrong to see any movie that has those kinds of scenes. But we do use, at our family, ClearPlay technology. You buy a DVD player and it takes out it takes out profanity, and it takes out sexually immoral scenes. So we like it. The hydroplate theory answers all these mysteries about the earth the way it is and the solar system. If the vapor canopy is true, what it does is it tells us where the water came from, and maybe it tells us why animals grew bigger and trees. But, things grow bigger when they live longer, and the genetics were different, and there was no radioactivity before the flood, which has really hurt every living creature on Earth. But CPT and vapor canopy, they don't answer the serious questions about why is the world the way it is. Try to Google this. This is for our own Real Science radio program. It's not as good as Walt Brown, but if you Google Young Earth, 750,000 pages. Our website is number 2. We're beat only by Wikipedia. And that includes beating all the major creation ministries. So we wouldn't mind if they beat us, because they have way more resources. We just are happy that, we're doing well. Dinosaur soft tissue, we are number 2 of 169,000 pages. Should Christians judge? You can do it without quotes, and we're also very high. But in quotes gives you more accurate. Should Christians judge? We're number 2 out of 14 million pages. So we're pretty unhappy with that. Now, we're pretty thrilled, but number 1 would be good. Why was Canaan cursed? It's surprising how many people Google that. 1 of 800,000 pages. And finally, what does the Bible say about abortion? Number 15, that's not too great, but of 2.2 million pages. And that article is at AmericanRightToLife.org. That's the global flood and hydroplate theory. I want to thank you very much for my co-host, Fred Williams, and for myself, Bob Enyart. God bless you guys.
Intelligent design and DNA. Scholars can't explain it all away. Get ready to be awed by the handiwork of God. Tune into Real Science Radio. Turn up the Real Science Radio. Keeping it I'm talking about.